Hello everyone. We hope you're doing well. We're doing great, and we truly appreciate your ongoing support. We'd like to briefly address some comments regarding our audiobook series. Rest assured, progress is ongoing. That said, your feedback is vital. If there's a novel you particularly enjoy and want to hear more of, please let us know in the comments. Each chapter requires a financial investment, so we can only continue series that receive strong audience interest. Although we retain core names and plot lines, we make significant editorial changes to enhance clarity, pacing, and immersion. These are not simple recitations. We work hard to deliver a polished, thoughtful listening experience. Without sufficient feedback or engagement, we may need to discontinue a series. So if you're enjoying something, don't stay silent. Your input truly matters. Note, our default audio speed is 3x. If that's too fast, let us know. We're happy to adjust it. Interested in early access to unreleased audiobooks? Visit our Patreon. You'll get to experience new content before it reaches YouTube. Just to clarify, I'm a fan like you. I've purchased these novels and adapted them with care, while respecting all rights and guidelines. For updates, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, X. YouTube update: recently, YouTube flagged some of our content for including mature themes, realistic violence, and darker story elements. As a result, we've decided to stop uploading anything that violates YouTube's guidelines. If you'd like access to the full, uncut versions including the more intense or mature content, you can find them on our Patreon page, where we upload everything first. Available now on Patreon: Shattered Innocence transmigrated into a novel as an extra. Transmigrating over 10,000 years late, I was forced to become a mighty presence. I, the celestial dragon, rule the heavens through the double gate, reigning supreme in countless worlds with beast taming, Tower of God sequence strength, cultivation when you take things to the extreme. Naruto is an Uchiha with cyst. WTF, the centuries-old ancestor in our family take concubine again. Plus 18, Ichi, reincarnated in Bleach as a wizard. Thanks for listening and happy listening. Chapter 1, the dark dungeon was damp and cold, filled with the stench of decay and human odor, making it a nauseating place to be. Torches soaked in oil were placed every few meters along the dungeon's moss-covered walls. The torches crackled and sputtered as they burned, releasing black smoke due to incomplete combustion, because of the stagnant air and low oxygen levels, which cast twisted and fearful shadows on the ground. Drip, drip, water droplets condensed at the top of the dungeon continually fell, landing on a dungeon guard soldier's head, gradually soaking his hair, then his cheeks, and finally trickling down his neck, icy cold. Yet the standing guard soldier dared not move, his whole body tensed like a dragon cavalry's javelin stuck into the ground. He made an effort to keep his breathing steady, but his peripheral vision involuntarily drifted to the dungeon's entrance. At the entrance, a young boy, 15 or 16 years old, dressed in somewhat simple noble attire, walked in expressionlessly. Behind the boy, the guard captain accompanied him obsequiously, a fawning smile on his face, but his eyes filled with an uneasy and immense fear. The guard captain couldn't help but feel afraid. The boy was the king's youngest son, the second in line for the throne after the prince. If the boy was even slightly displeased, he could lose his head at any moment. Thinking of this, the guard captain's heart tightened further, even his facial expression became somewhat stiff. Richard, however, paid little attention to the guard captain's demeanor. He had been in this medieval-like world for 15 years, and his extraordinary psychological resilience allowed him to fully adapt to his identity here. He realized what actions would most efficiently achieve his goals and unlock his ultimate mystery. D.A. Richard stepped forward into the dungeon, speaking to the guard captain. I previously asked you to lead a team to capture a wizard or someone related to supernatural phenomena for my research. You've conducted 2 attempts already without success, only bringing in a group of ugly farmers as filler. This is your 3rd attempt. Are you sure you've really caught them this time? My patience has its limits. Prince, this time. This time. The guard captain instantly broke into a sweat, his Adam's apple bobbing a few times as a stiff voice emerged from his throat. This time. I swear I've really caught them. And what about the situation with the soldiers' benefits? Richard asked again. Huh? The guard captain was taken aback. Benefits? What benefits? Richard raised an eyebrow. Don't tell me all the compensation for injured soldiers has been embezzled by you alone. If you did that, I'd almost admire your bravery. No. The guard captain widened his eyes, realizing and stammering, Sir. Prince, there were no injuries or casualties. Huh? No casualties? Your soldiers captured individuals related to supernatural phenomena without any casualties. Yes, not a single one. The guard captain replied earnestly. All right. Richard spoke aloud, having already formed a suspicion in his mind. He continued, Tell me, what did you catch this time? Yes, Prince. The guard captain steadied himself and answered seriously, "This time we captured 4, 1 white-faced demon, 1 half-human, 1 vampire, and 1 DA. After a while, Richard stopped in front of a cell deep in the dungeon, squinting at a figure inside. The individual's skin was unnaturally pale, devoid of any blood color, looking extraordinarily terrifying. He sat on the cell's floor, his eyes filled with fearful apprehension gazing back. The guard captain's voice sounded, afraid Richard hadn't noticed. He said, "Prince, this is the white-faced demon we captured, look." Richard only glanced briefly before proceeding to move ahead. The guard captain was stunned, unsure why Richard was uninterested, but he nevertheless bent his neck and followed. Soon, Richard stopped for the second time. Within a cell beside him, an odd-looking figure huddled in a corner. The individual's face was full of wrinkles, appearing over 50 years old, yet standing barely a meter tall, like a child, which made people feel a sense of eerie discomfort. The guard captain explained, "Prince, this is a half-human." Before he finished speaking, Richard shook his head and strode forward again, then stopped. In the third cell was a monstrous-looking human, pale-skinned with red blotches all over his face, neck, and the backs of his hands. Some areas were even decaying. His mouth slightly open, revealing teeth that seemed unusually long, with a sinister blood-red hue, enough to send shivers down one's spine. "Sir. Prince." The guard captain pointed to the person in the third cell, visibly nervous. He spoke, "This is the vampire, you have to be careful not to get harmed by him." "Ha." Richard sounded, his voice was a bit cold. "Prince, you." Richard spoke, "An albino, a dwarf, and a porphyria patient, these are your white-faced demon, half-human, and vampire? Well. Do you even have any knowledge of biology?" "Oh right, I forgot. In the medieval times, there was essentially no biology knowledge, but that's no excuse. You should have realized upon catching them without any soldiers being injured, right? Yet for the previous 2 failures, you didn't learn anything? Well. To say nothing of other matters, take the vampire for instance, did you see him transform into a bat as per legend? Or can he fly?" The guard captain trembled slightly, but the next moment, he forced courage. "Prince, indeed, I didn't see this wicked vampire transform into a bat or fly, but his skin truly can't be exposed to sunlight. Once in sunlight, it decays. Look at him now, it's because he was exposed to sunlight on the way here. When I captured him, he was also drinking blood, and he particularly despised garlic. Prince, if this isn't a vampire, what is it? However, he merely has porphyria." Richard proclaimed expressionlessly. "Huh?" The guard captain was baffled. "In other words, he's just a patient. What you observed are symptoms caused by the disease, albeit much like the legendary vampire." "It isn't." "Why?" The guard captain was riddled with bewilderment. "Do you really want to hear the reason?" Richard asked. "Well. Fine, I'll explain it to you," Richard said, proceeding. "Porphyria, also known as porphyrin disease, is a group of porphyrin metabolism disorder diseases caused by a lack of certain enzymes or reduced enzyme activity in the hemoglobin synthesis pathway. It can be congenital or acquired, and once it appears, considering the current era, well, there's no means to completely cure it, you can only barely survive, becoming this ghostly appearance." "Huh?" The guard captain was still utterly puzzled. "Put it this way," Richard offered a more detailed explanation, "our blood consists of many components, one of which is hemoglobin. Normally, the body synthesizes hemoglobin using iron elements and porphyrins with the catalysis of a specific enzyme. However, some individuals lack that specific enzyme, hindering hemoglobin synthesis, resulting in extremely high porphyrins levels in their bodies. Porphyrins are highly sensitive to light and harmless in darkness, but once exposed to light, activated by ultraviolet rays, they convert into a carnivorous toxin, causing widespread red spots, blisters, or even ulcers on the body. It also affects the mouth, leading to gum sores and exposed roots, making the teeth appear particularly long, gradually turning purplish-brown due to porphyrin accumulation. Additionally, since they cannot synthesize hemoglobin fully, they can't produce normal blood. Porphyria patients suffer from severe anemia and must supplement blood externally to survive. Intravenous transfusion is one viable method, but given this world's technological level, they can't manage it and must therefore opt for the other, drinking. The hemoglobin has incredibly strong life force, resisting digestive liquids, entering the digestive system to be absorbed via small intestine. They despise garlic for a simple reason: garlic contains allicin with strong antibacterial effects. Due to their unique physical constitution, consuming garlic can induce and intensely aggravate their symptoms. In fact, if you pierce them with silver objects, they'll equally detest it. Silver also poses a formidable antibacterial action. In short, You must understand, vampires are vampires, while porphyria is porphyria. Maybe their manifestations appear somewhat similar, but they are not the same at all. What I want you to find are true vampires and phenomena relating to wizards and spells, not merely find patients, understand? When you captured them, they didn't resist or kill, they pleaded and wailed. In your heart, you didn't question anything at all. Huh? Or do you think merely accomplishing the task on the surface is sufficient? The first 2 times were like this, and now the 3rd time too. My patience is really limited. Prince, The guard captain could no longer speak, his heart overwhelmed with enormous terror. He'd heard many cruel stories about the prince, and if the prince was truly angered. Richard didn't continue entangling with the guard captain, proceeding to stride toward the deepest part of the dungeon, speaking. You said you captured a 4th, a true wizard. Well, let's see if it's genuine or not. Chapter 2. The guard captain tried hard to raise his head, forcing himself to calm down, and tried to catch up. Prince, it must be true, it must be true. I saw with my own eyes that he can release flames. Richard, who was walking towards the deepest part of the dungeon, stopped in front of the last cell. Inside was a person dressed like a wizard in a black hooded robe, appearing extremely mysterious but not at all comfortable. 4 iron chains respectively bound his hands and legs, preventing him from moving freely. A rope was tied into his mouth, reportedly to keep him from chanting spells. At this point, the person appeared somewhat calm, not as panicked as the 3 wrongly accused before him. However, upon noticing his slightly flickering gaze, Richard could guess that maybe he did have some tricks. But the probability of him being a real wizard was close to 0. Prince, someone reported this man for causing trouble in a tavern, not paying for his food, spreading rumors about seeing a fire-breathing dragon, and claiming to be a wizard, which caught my attention, so I took the team to arrest him. At that time, when we caught him, I saw with my own eyes that he released flames, almost burning one of my soldiers. He is definitely a real wizard, said the guard captain. The next moment he took a bundle from his subordinate, and carefully handed it over. Prince, these are the things the man was carrying with him. There are short ones and all sorts of bizarre casting materials inside. At this moment, the captured wizard in the dungeon spoke up. Although his mouth was gagged with a rope, his speech was extremely indistinct, yet still threatening. You better release me, or suffer my wrath. I tell you, I am a wizard. Do you know what a wizard is? I can ride a fire-breathing dragon and use magic to easily kill you. Richard ignored the wizard, reached for the bundle, and opened it. The first thing he saw was several black sticks approximately 20 centimeters long and about 1 centimeter in diameter. The rest were bottles and jars of unknown materials. Richard randomly opened a bottle and found inside pieces of a yellow substance that looked like candle wax. After sniffing and detecting a faint garlic-like smell, he couldn't help but chuckle softly. Prince, the flames you saw earlier, did they appear like this? Richard asked, picking up a short wand from the bundle, rubbing it against the yellow wax-like substance, and then forcefully scraping it against the stone wall beside him. The intense friction caused heating, and with a poof, a flame burst out from the tip of the short wand. At this moment, the entire wand looked just like an oversized match. The guard captain's eyes widened instantly. Prince, could it be that you also know magic? What do you think? Richard retorted, I do intend to understand the principles of magic and subsequently figure out some other issues. But reason has to be given. Magic is magic, and tricks are just tricks. If I could use magic, would I still need to go to such lengths as to have you arrest people? But you now. The guard captain couldn't help but look at the burning short wand in Richard's hand. Just yellow phosphorus, Richard said, tossing the short wand into a small puddle of water on the ground, extinguishing it. Yellow phosphorus? Yes, yellow phosphorus, Richard briefly explained. This yellow waxy solid substance is called yellow phosphorus or white phosphorus. Its melting point is 44.1 degrees Celsius, and it can spontaneously ignite at 34 degrees Celsius, even in humid air around 40 degrees Celsius, just like now. It can be used to make some matches or smoke bombs and has nothing to do with legendary magic. So, you caught the wrong person again. As Richard spoke, he gently patted the guard captain on the shoulder. Miraculously, as Richard's hand landed, the guard captain seemed to shrink segment by segment, finally sitting on the ground with a thud, his face pale and bloodless. Raising his head in panic, the guard captain looked at Richard's indifferent expression, feeling a chill emanate from his soul. Bang, and he started kowtowing vigorously. Prince, I was wrong, please give me another chance. I will definitely catch the person you really want. The last chance. The guard captain was initially stunned, then quickly nodded. Understood. Richard stepped forward, intending to leave with the swindler wizard's bundle, when suddenly his eyes caught something. He took out an item from the bundle. It was a piece of snake skin, still warm to the touch, just as if it had been toasted before the fireplace, feeling very unusual, somewhat like something he had been searching for. Richard's gaze sharpened, and he abruptly turned back, walking to the front of the cell, holding up the snakeskin and asking the swindler wizard, "What is this? Tell me." Who would have thought the swindler wizard, feeling somewhat backed, would lift his head proudly, nostrils flaring, completely ignoring him. The guard captain asked tentatively from the side, "Prince, what do you think? How should we deal with him?" The wizard in the cell gazed with dangerous and malicious eyes, as if saying, "What do you think should be done with me? Let me go now, or you'll suffer." Richard chuckled coldly, drawing out a second short wand from the bundle, rubbing it with the yellow phosphorus, and scraped it against the wall, igniting it, then threw it. The burning wand drew an arc through the air, passed through the cell bars, and landed in the straw-filled cell where the wizard was confined. The straw caught fire instantly, and soon flames and heavy black smoke were rising. Amidst the wizard's terrified gaze, Richard turned and said to the guard captain, "For useless people, how to deal with them? Like those few patients you arrested by mistake, let them go. As for this prisoner, I truly detest him, so just burn him to death." "Yes, sir, I understand." "Very well. Da. With those steps, Richard walked towards the dungeon exit, the wizard's vague curses trailing behind, slowly changing in tone. "Kid, you come back. Put me down. I beg you." Prince, I was wrong, I'll tell you what that thing you asked about was." Prince, I know you're interested in things related to wizards, that thing is the skin of a flame python that shed. Da. Richard suddenly halted, and before the guard captain could react, he heard Richard order, "Extinguish the fire." Huh? The guard captain was stunned, and the next moment he quickly turned around, and with a roar, over a dozen soldiers stumbled over, each carrying a wooden bucket of water, running quickly to the swindler wizard's cell, pouring it in without even looking. Splash, splash. The flames, which were not very large in the first place, were completely extinguished after the dozen or so buckets of water were poured out, though the iron-chained wizard became soaking wet. With a creak, the cell door opened. Richard stepped onto the damp, waterlogged straw inside, and looked up at the wizard. With a slight gesture, the guard captain obligingly stepped forward to untie the rope gagging the wizard's mouth. The wizard breathed a sigh of relief but hadn't started speaking before Richard said, "You have 1 minute to convince me not to kill you. If your words cannot convince me, then rest assured, your subsequent death will certainly be more painful than being burned alive." The wizard shivered all over. I. Still 50 seconds. The wizard, awakened with a shiver, realized his life or death lay entirely in his own hands. He quickly started speaking, "Prince, honestly, I'm not a wizard, I'm just a swindler, Richard showed no interest in the other's confession, his expression calm as he reminded, 40 seconds. The wizard's tone heightened, "I know you're interested in wizards and magic. Just a few days ago, I saw with my own eyes a python entirely wreathed in flames. I believe it would certainly be useful to you. And that skin in the bundle is part of the shed skin of the python that I found. I sold the rest." "You've seen a flame python? Then tell me, exactly how many days ago was it?" Richard asked, his eyes locked onto the wizard's gaze. The next moment, seeing the wizard's eyes involuntarily shift downwards to the right, Richard understood this involuntary action during recollection generally indicated he was speaking the truth. It was exactly 3 days ago. "Morning or afternoon?" Noon." "What was the weather like? Sunny or cloudy?" "Sunny." "Where was the sun relative to you?" On the left." "What did it look like?" "Similar to an ordinary python, except it was on fire." "What color?" "Red." "How long?" "More than 3 meters." "How much more?" "About half a meter or more." "Specific location?" "On a small hill over 10 miles outside the city." After a brief silence, Richard paused his interrogation, and the guard captain quietly asked, "Prince, what do you think?" "Untie him, then tie him onto a horse. You take a team and leave the city with me immediately." Right now?" "Now," said Richard. "If we capture the flame python he spoke of, we'll release him. If we do not capture it, we'll slice his flesh piece by piece to feed the dogs." Prince. The wizard shouted loudly, fearing for his life. He quickly reminded, "Prince, to catch that python, proper preparation is essential. After all, it is a demonized creature capable of magic, very dangerous." "Then I'll have people bring more bows and arrows," the guard captain suggested, thinking quickly, "and bring a big net." "No, nets are no use," the wizard urgently advised. "That python's whole body catches fire, it'll burn through any net." "Then how would you suggest handling it?" The wizard's momentum weakened immediately. Bring everything necessary, select some elite soldiers. Richard made a decision. Additionally, Richard continued, go to the KGB shop in the city and notify the third steward, asking them to bring the goods I previously ordered, and together they'll help find the flame python. Yes. Chapter 003, Flame Python and English Longbow. The sun blazed high in the sky. In June, the enormous sun, like a fireball, seemed to go mad, relentlessly scorching the world. The air was unbearably hot, and the water in the river on the plain seemed about to boil. Beside the river stood a majestic city, Blue Lion City, the capital of the Blue Lion Kingdom, grand and imposing like an ancient beast crouching on the earth. Inside the city, the buildings were arranged in an orderly manner, radiating outward with the central palace as the core. Suddenly, the gate of the palace opened, and a team of galloping cavalry surged out of the city, causing pedestrians on the streets to scatter in avoidance. Soon, the cavalry charged out of Blue Lion City, setting foot on the dusty road outside, stirring up a cloud of yellow dust. However, the cavalry pressed on regardless, maintaining their formation as they rushed into the distance. An hour later, Richard arrived at a remote hillside, about 10 miles outside the city, and leaped off his horse. The cavalry behind him also dismounted, scattering in all directions to vaguely guard Richard and a burly man dressed in black. The burly man in black held a box in his hands. He was the third steward of the KGB shop, though he had a more confidential role, such as being Richard's cultivated confidant. In fact, the KGB and several other shops were either openly or covertly established and controlled by Richard. He wielded an influence far greater than his title as prince. This was partly because he possessed abilities far beyond those of an ordinary prince, even surpassing the standards of this era. Further, he had never valued the title of prince, especially after an incident several years ago. In his view, the title of prince was more a disguise and a burden. If he could, he would have preferred to discard this identity and conduct himself without any restrictions. For instance, researching this world, and investigating the always rumored magic power. Thinking about this, Richard glanced aside. To the side, the wizard, who had been bound to the horse, was pale from the jouncing. After being untied by the dungeon guard captain and yanked off the horse, he could barely stand. The guard captain couldn't care less. Knowing the wizard was a fraud, fear had vanished, leaving only anger. He dragged the wizard over with kicks and shoves and then smiled at Richard. Your Highness, look. Richard ignored the guard captain and looked at the wizard, asking, where did you see the python you mentioned? Point it out to me. There. The wizard raised his head and looked towards the distance, carefully observing for a moment before eventually pointing with his finger, under the tree. I was just passing by, and the python suddenly appeared, almost scaring me to death. But fortunately, it seemed uninterested in me and quickly left, letting me snatch back my life and its shed skin. Richard nodded slightly and then turned his head to look at the guard captain. The guard captain waved his hand vigorously, and the accompanying dozen soldiers drew their weapons and quickly encircled forward. 10 meters, 20 meters, 30 meters. They quickly reached the place the wizard indicated, but there wasn't even a rabbit, let alone a large python. The guard captain's gaze shifted towards the wizard with some displeasure. The wizard hunched his shoulders, fearing Richard would think he was lying, and hastened to explain, Your Highness, perhaps that python has gone elsewhere. Richard crouched down, his eyes falling on the ground. He peeled back the juvenile weeds, revealing a mark below as if scorched by flames, showing evidence of a flame-stricken python having passed through here. Richard used his fingernail to scrape a little soil and brought it to his nose to sniff. It had a garlicky yellow phosphorus smell, intermingled with a peculiar odor of sulfur. Richard stood up and turned to the guard captain, commanding, search ahead, paying attention to the ground and the trees. Snakes are ectothermic, disliking cold and favoring heat. If demonization hasn't altered the strait, then in such weather, it's likely hiding somewhere shaded, so be alert. Yes. The guard captain nodded emphatically and, without another word, conveyed Richard's order to the soldiers, instructing them to spread out and continue searching forward. About a dozen minutes later, a report came back that traces of a python had been found in a dense thicket over 200 meters ahead, but it was uncertain whether it was the one they were searching for. Richard did not hesitate, hurrying over to a place a few dozen meters from the python, where the guard captain stopped him. Your Highness, be careful, the python is dangerous, the guard captain said. Let's have someone test it first to see if it catches fire entirely. Richard shook his head, said expressionlessly, no need. While speaking, Richard's gaze was already fixed on the thicket tens of meters away. A brown, mottled python was nestled inside, its eyes closed as if dozing. The light danced around its surroundings, appearing slightly distorted. Richard knew this was the refraction of light passing through different media. There was only air around the python, So the cause of the refraction had only one explanation: the surrounding temperature was high, significantly higher than the air's average temperature. Considering the surrounding vegetation wasn't scorched, it wouldn't exceed the 200 degrees Celsius ignition point, likely ranging between tens of degrees to over 100 degrees Celsius. Ordinary pythons couldn't achieve this, so the answer was clear. Richard spoke up to the guard captain: "Tell your men to prepare. No need to test, proceed directly with the capture. First, use bows and arrows to test its defenses. It's best to capture it alive after wounding it, if not, dead is also acceptable." "Yes." The guard captain nodded and quickly left Richard's side to begin organizing. Shouts echoed as several soldiers, skilled in archery, soon picked up their bows. The soldiers used bows resembling medieval English longbows, which, in Richard's view, were similar. Such bows typically reached about 1.5 meters, with some extending up to 2 meters, the bow's back made from a single bent wood, the material being yew wood, sturdy and elastic. The bowstrings were made from sheepskin or cow tendon tanned. These bows, due to their extended bowback length, endowed arrows with immense power and an ultra-long range far surpassing modern counterparts, capable of shooting arrows over 350 meters away. Ordinarily, they could penetrate leather armor at distances of 200 to 250 meters. Within 200 meters, they could pierce chain armor. Within 100 meters, they could penetrate plate armor. Within 50 meters, aside from shields and specially crafted armor, almost nothing could withstand their shots, making them virtually unstoppable. At this time, the soldiers and the python were roughly 50 meters apart. The 4 soldiers were veterans, showing distinctly uneven arm lengths due to years of archery training, a mark of experience. Grabbing their bows, they took bundles of 24 arrows from the quivers on their backs, stabbing them into the ground in front of them after untying them. Each arrow was nearly a meter long, allowing easy grabbing and effortless continuous shooting without bending over. The 4 soldiers readied themselves, exchanged glances, took a deep breath, each grabbing an arrow to knock onto the longbow, and began aiming. Whooshing sounds echoed consecutively as 4 meteoric arrows shot forth toward the python's position, but not one hit. The closest was still over a dozen centimeters away. After all, not all soldiers were dead-on marksmen, and on battlefields, hit rates were generally ensured by concentrated volleys. Richard remained unfazed by this, continuing to watch. The 4 soldiers, having failed once, quickly grabbed another arrow each, knocking them onto their longbows, this time taking a bit longer to aim before 4 more arrows whooshed out. Having been startled, the python was just about to take action when 4 arrows fell, 2 hitting directly. One arrow struck its tail, while another pierced its body, causing crimson blood to flow swiftly. Hiss. The python hissed, seemingly enraged, twisting violently, snapping 2 arrows with distinct cracks. Baring its mouth, it spat a big burst of sparks, advancing toward the group, intensifying the tense atmosphere and causing some soldiers to instinctively back away. At this moment, the most excited was neither Richard nor the guard captain, but the wizard. The wizard almost jumped up, grabbing the guard captain, exclaiming repeatedly, "Did you see that? Did you see that? What I said was true, there really is a fire-breathing python here, so His Highness can't kill me." The guard captain was too tense to bother responding, with a swing of his arm knocking the wizard to the ground, drawing his long sword and using his imposing demeanor to calm his slightly panicked soldiers. He shouted loudly, "What are you afraid of? Keep shooting with the bows, and the rest prepare the nets to capture it alive." "Yes," the soldiers responded promptly, getting busy. Chapter 4, Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Arrows continuously shot toward the python. The closer they got to the python, the higher the accuracy. Soon, the python was covered with arrows, bleeding profusely. It appeared to be severely injured, and its movement slowed down. Seeing this as a chance not to be missed, the guard captain waved his hand, commanding the remaining soldiers to rush in with a large net and throw it over the python. The net's holes were only the size of a fingernail, and the 3-meter-long python couldn't escape. It struggled within the net, only binding itself tighter. The guard captain had a sly smile on his lips, thinking the task was about to be completed. Yet, the soldiers who surrounded the python suddenly let out a scream and quickly scattered. This. The guard captain's eyes widened in disbelief as he watched. Suddenly, half-a-meter-high flames puffed up from the python's body. The orange-yellow color of the flames burned the entire net open and incinerated the arrows stuck in its body. In the next moment, the python's speed surged. It lunged forward, biting the slowest soldier. The soldier screamed, ensnared by the python's coils, fell silent almost instantly. A moment later, the python pursued the other soldiers, leaving behind a charred corpse at the scene. "Damn it!" The guard captain's eyes turned red. Richard watched, his eyes flashing slightly. The color of the flames was closely related to the temperature. Aside from the influence of the fuel, generally speaking, the higher the brightness, the higher the temperature. For instance, the most common sky blue flames could reach about 2,500 degrees Celsius. Red flames, on the other hand, typically had a temperature of around 1,000 degrees Celsius. As for black flames, they looked cool but were filled with smoke due to incomplete combustion, with temperatures reaching only about 300 degrees Celsius, far below charcoal fires, which were around 600 degrees Celsius. Based on the current orange-yellow color of the python's flames, they should be roughly around 1,500 degrees Celsius. Although not as impressive as the sky blue flames purest of the furnace, they shouldn't be underestimated. After all, the melting point of iron was 1,538 degrees Celsius, and these flames were almost enough to melt steel. It really seems like a magic creature, Richard muttered to himself. This time, I am finally not disappointed. But as for capturing it, it's not going to be easy to handle. Ah! Another scream rang out as the flame-wreathed python coiled around another lagging soldier, taking his life. Seeing this, the guard captain's eyes blazed with fury, his hidden ferocity flaring within. Watching the python pursue a third soldier, he gritted his teeth, clutching his long sword, and charged toward the python. 30 meters, 25 meters, 20 meters. The intense heat surged from the distant python's body. The guard captain could feel his skin, exposed outside his armor, tingling with pain, but he ignored it completely and continued rushing closer. 20 meters, 15 meters, 10 meters. The guard captain felt his iron armor become scalding hot, like a branding iron searing his skin, his expression twisted in pain. Yet, he still endured it, raised his long sword high, and aimed at the python's head, intending to slash it down. At that moment, a short arrow whizzed past from behind him, scraping his ear and leaving a burning scratch on his face. The guard captain was stunned and instinctively looked back, seeing Richard in the distance, expressionless, holding a crossbow in one hand and making a comeback gesture with the other. If you don't want to die, come back, Richard said plainly. Prince. The guard captain hesitated for a moment but eventually chose to obey, retreating quickly to Richard's side, panting. Prince, this flame-breathing python is really difficult to deal with. The rope net couldn't hold it. Should we go back and ask the craftsman to make an iron net before coming again? Otherwise, at this rate, none of my men will survive. I said when I came here, an ordinary net won't work, the wizard mumbled softly beside him. Say that again. The guard captain glared, looking as if he wanted to devour the wizard. If it weren't for you hiding the strength of this damned python, my men wouldn't have suffered such losses. I think you're doing it on purpose. Enough, Richard spoke. Whether he did it on purpose or not is not the point. Even if we go back, an iron net is useless now. The flames on this python are hot enough to melt an iron net. Then what do we do? The guard captain was anxious. There is a way, Richard replied, turning his head to look at the burly man in black beside him. The black-clad strong man had been carrying a box, following him quietly, never saying a word, like a shadow. Now, it was time to use that shadow. Use the latest product you brought from the shop, Richard whispered. Yes, the black-clad strong man nodded, saying nothing more as he quickly opened a box and took out a bomb. Yes, a bomb. At least it looked like a bomb, a very primitive bomb, a metallic ball with a long fuse attached. After taking out the bomb, the black-clad strong man, without waiting for Richard's command, acted on his own. Swinging his arm, he hurled the bomb far out. The black-clad strong man was strong, his throwing skills were excellent, and the heavy metallic ball, thrown like a hand grenade, rolled accurately to the flame python. At this time, the flame python was engulfed in its flames, so the bomb's fuse didn't need to be lit, it caught fire automatically. Duck! Richard immediately shouted. No one dared to disobey, and everyone dropped to the ground. The next moment, a loud explosion echoed, jarring their ears painfully. The ground shook violently, and a strong gust of wind swept through, kicking up a huge cloud of dust. When everything settled, the guard captain and the soldiers stood up, looking at the python's original position with widening mouths. They saw the once unrivaled python now lay with its body broken, nearly cleaved in two like a snapped, dried branch. It lay on the ground, barely breathing. Despite this, the guard captain dared not be too careless. With Richard's permission, he immediately called soldiers to use longbows from afar for a round of concentrated shooting, killing the python thoroughly before heaving a sigh of relief. After finishing this, the guard captain turned to look at Richard. Richard did not display much excitement, maintaining a calm expression as he instructed, bring the python along and hasten back to the city. I must seize the time to dissect and research. Otherwise, with too much delay, it will lose essential vitality, causing many things to change. Also, everyone, do not speak of today's events to anyone. Understand? Yes, the guard captain quickly responded, ordering soldiers to tie the 3-meter python onto a horse, ignoring the poor trembling horse. At this point, Richard turned to the black-clad strong men and whispered, "The explosives were insufficiently potent. As expected, it should have killed it outright, so continue to make improvements. I'll provide you with some plans." "Understood. That's good, let's go back." "Yes." The black-clad strong men picked up the box and left. Richard mounted his horse, leading the mini cavalrymen back to Blue Lion City. Chapter 5, in the afternoon, at the Blue Lion City Palace. The sound of hoofbeats echoed as Richard, accompanied by the guard captain and his party, returned to his residence. The first thing that came into view was a massive square, nearly 100 meters in circumference, paved with large, smooth slabs of stone, immaculately clean. On one side of the square was a series of ascending steps, leading up to a grand palace. Richard dismounted in the square, and the guard captain instructed the soldiers to unload the dead python and carry it into the palace, with Richard following behind. They hadn't taken many steps when a voice sounded behind them, followed by hurried footsteps. Someone was catching up. "Prince, Prince." Richard turned his head and saw a young man in his 20s catching up, dressed in extravagant clothing, with gold embroidery on the sleeves and intricate patterns on the collar. His golden hair shone like gold, and his face exuded kindness, as if capable of dissolving all malice. The person was Richard's personal guard captain, responsible for leading the entire personal guard to ensure Richard's safety. His name was Edward Angel, and he was no ordinary man, being the son of an earl, making him a noble. He willingly became Richard's personal guard captain not because his family had fallen into decline, but because his family sought to strengthen their ties with the royal family and express loyalty. This was a common practice among medieval nobles, a form of hostage-taking, but if handled well, it could bring great benefits. For instance, if Richard became the next king, both Edward and his family, as the personal guard captain, would naturally receive special treatment. By then, they might not remain an earl, but become a marquis. Edward clearly understood this point and was diligent in serving Richard daily. However, perhaps because he focused his mind on this, his own skills were lacking, and his courtly swordsmanship was only adequate for display and inferior for combat compared to a soldier. Due to this, Richard did not inform Edward when he went to the dungeon to capture the python, yet Edward somehow learned of it. As Richard was contemplating, the guard captain Edward had already caught up, stopping a step away with a slight pant, and said, "Prince, I heard you went to the dungeon this morning? And at noon, you took people from the dungeon out of the city to capture a python?" "Yes," Richard responded, stepping forward. Hearing Richard's confirmation, Edward immediately became anxious and said, "Prince, I am your personal guard captain. The personal guard is your most loyal subordinates. By going alone to the dungeon and capturing a python, what if someone meant you harm? If you were harmed, even our entire personal guard would be unable to wash away the guilt by collective suicide." Richard glanced at Edward, not believing his words to be sincere, but he was too indifferent to delve further, and said blandly, "Edward, if your swordsmanship were better, I might consider taking you next time. Moreover, who in the entire kingdom would dare to harm me?" Edward's eyes shifted, and he leaned in toward Richard, quietly reminding, "Prince, you really must be careful. The elder prince has always been unfriendly towards you, and now with the king sick, what if? What if?" "There's no what if," Richard shook his head with a cold smile. "The king isn't dead yet, so my dear brother, William Austen, wouldn't dare make a move against me." But Edward wanted to say more, but Richard waved his hand, no longer paying attention, and walked to the end of the square, climbing the steps. Passing through 12 massive marble columns, he entered the great hall of the palace, with Edward quickly following. The entire hall spanned over 200 square meters, supposedly extremely spacious. But actually, it was quite crowded. The hall floor had dozens of tables, with various instruments and equipment on them. In front of each table was a busy maid, some plump, some slender, some tall, some short, some dark, some fair, tensely operating the equipment. Upon a table near the door rested a complete set of crude distillation equipment, centered around a pot being heated in boiling water. The pot's mouth was sealed, with only a leather tube leading out, connecting finally to an oddly shaped iron pipe. The iron pipe was submerged in water at its middle, with one end higher and connected to the leather tube, while the lower end was joined to a funnel resembling a bull's horn, through which colorless liquid dripped into a porcelain bottle. Puff puff, due to problems with the equipment connections, white mist continually sprayed out, and the air was permeated with a slightly pungent alcohol odor. The speed at which liquid dripped into the porcelain bottle at the end was slowing. Drip drip, 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 drip. A maid with a ponytail looked helplessly at the apparatus in front of her, wide-eyed and unsure of what to do. Richard frowned, stepping closer, and the ponytailed maid stiffened like she'd been electrocuted, her body tense. PR. Prince. I asked you to distill high-concentration alcohol. How's it going? I. The ponytailed maid's voice trembled, but to avoid being scolded, she forced herself to answer, It's okay. I guess. Okay? Richard's face was expressionless as he pointed at the continuously leaking pungent white mist from the equipment connections, asking, This is what you call okay? Where's the airtightness I asked for? The alcohol vapor is leaking. How are you going to collect high-concentration alcohol solution? Richard reached out to the water basin submerging the iron pipe, feeling the temperature, and spoke again. How long has it been since you changed the water? It's warm. Do you think this can cool and condense? Do you think this can turn high-temperature alcohol vapor into droplets, to be collected into the bottle by the bullhorn funnel? I remember yesterday I explained the distillation's key points to you and others. Why have you done it like this? Prince, I. The ponytailed maid started trembling, her voice tinged with a sob. Prince, I'm sorry. I'm too dull-headed, I can't remember. PR. Prince, please give me another chance. I certainly. Forget it, there's no need, Richard said calmly. I've said before, any maid in my palace can make mistakes, even murder. But one thing is non-negotiable, understanding what I convey after my explanations, and executing it. It's not because you're stupid if you don't understand or forget, it's because your learning ability is poor, and the least needed is someone with poor learning capability. Because I don't have the time or energy for education, nor the time or energy to develop every person into a scientifically cultured adolescent. Therefore, as of now, you are no longer part of the palace. This afternoon, pack your things and leave. Don't make me repeat myself. As Richard spoke, the ponytailed and pretty maid's body trembled, her face pale. Being expelled from the palace meant she could no longer earn 5 silver coins a month, and her impoverished family could not sustain without it, surely making this nothing short of a disaster. The ponytailed maid couldn't help but cry out, Prince, Your Highness. Please, give me one more chance. My father owes others a lot of money, and if I leave here without a means to repay it, he will be beaten to death. I beg you. Richard seemed not to hear, stepping toward the palace's depths, while the ponytailed maid's face grew despairing. Following Richard, the guard captain Edward saw this. He glanced at the ponytailed maid's pretty face, then at the rest of the busy maids in the hall who were quite ordinary looking, his eyes flickering. Quickly stepping forward, he caught up to Richard and said, Prince, I think that maid named Fu wasn't bad, just maybe unfamiliar due to a short tenure, leading to her poor performance. Her family's in such hardship, perhaps keep her a few more days, and if she tries harder. Richard halted, looking at Edward calmly. Edward's body jolted, displaying a somewhat fearful expression. Prince, I know what you're thinking, Richard spoke. But I must tell you, Edward, that I can endure ugly appearances, poor character, vile actions, as long as the job is done. In contrast, if someone lacks intelligence, is incompetent, and has poor learning capability, then no matter how beautiful she is, I won't endure her. Because in the realm of science, it's all about merits, not appearances. In short, I'm busy. Ever since I've been here, I've been busy for over a decade, busy exploring unconventional matters like spells, solving problems. Therefore, anything that hinders me is an obstacle, and I will not tolerate obstacles. If you're sympathetic to that girl, fine, she can stay, provided you do her work as well, that's it. Edward lowered his head, his expression swiftly changing, and after a moment, he murmured, I understand, my prince, before turning to approach the ponytailed maid. The ponytailed maid's eyes flickered as Edward neared, afraid but trying her luck, said softly, Master, what about me? Edward didn't respond, kept coming closer, and the girl looked puzzled, subconsciously stepping back. Then Edward suddenly reached out his hand. Ah! The maid cried as her ponytail was seized by Edward in a firm grasp. With a harsh yank from Edward, the girl was nearly in tears from the pain. Regardless, Edward dragged her by the hair out of the palace and, with a final tug, knocked her down on the ground, coldly saying, I warn you, you angered the prince. Get out of the palace immediately and never appear before him again, or mind your life. In utter fear, the maid stood, while Edward had already turned back into the palace, a smile on his face as he chased after Richard. Prince, I dealt with that dense maid for you. In the afternoon, I'll ensure to find someone smarter, more obedient to replace her. Is that agreeable with you? Do as you like, Richard replied, ambivalent. In fact, Prince, I think some of the matters can be delegated. There will be plenty eager to assist you, freeing you to focus on more crucial tasks. After all, you're a prince and should be tackling more significant affairs, Edward said with persuasive earnestness. Such as? Well. Prince, you see, the king's health has been poor, this time bedridden, uncertain of recovery. Should anything unfortunate happen, and the elder prince ascends, some things might be detrimental to you, so early preparation seems wise. You might consider reaching out to some nobles for support. At the least, ensuring your interests aren't compromised would secure a satisfying domain along with a Grand Duke title. Swallowing hard, seeing little reaction from Richard, Edward continued, compared to this, I find the time you've spent seeking various peculiarities and conducting wizard-related research truly unnecessary. It's fine as a hobby, but devoting all efforts is unreasonable. Oh? Richard laughed softly, you mean I should delve into Crown Prince politics? Well. Edward, tell me, do you think Crown Prince politics is more crucial to me or wizardry and spells? I believe Crown Prince politics is more significant, Your Highness, Edward said earnestly. Richard merely shook his head slightly, moving forward to push open a red door and step inside. Startled, Edward halted at the door. He knew this was Richard's private laboratory, typically used only when Richard personally conducted special research, with Richard greatly disliking interruptions then. Sighing softly, pausing at the door, Edward couldn't help but mutter to himself, Prince, you really should heed some of my words, or you make things difficult for me. My family has staked half of its future on you, and now with the king seriously ill, if you do nothing. Chapter 6. Richard didn't listen to what Edward was saying and appeared in the room of the independent laboratory. What he saw was a spacious room more than 50 square meters in size, with walls painted pure white. In the middle of the floor stood several black walnut tables joined together, resembling an operating table, on which lay the snake's carcass that the soldiers had just brought in. Around the table were numerous wooden stands, some of which held various instruments, experimental materials, and tools, while others were instruments themselves. Most of these were far beyond the current technological level of this world and were created with great effort by Richard. In simple terms, the technology level of the room Richard was in now was more than 300 years ahead of its time, and the scientific thought contained within was over 7 or 8 centuries ahead. Squinting his eyes, Richard stepped toward a wooden stand. On the side of the stand was a handle, below which was a spout, and further down was a wooden bucket. Richard reached out and pulled the handle, positioned it under the spout, and after a brief wait, a colorless, transparent liquid with a pungent odor flowed from the spout onto his hand. This was 75% alcohol, which could be used as a disinfectant. Richard carefully scrubbed each finger, ensuring every part was clean, then closed the spout and flicked his hands a few times until the remaining alcohol evaporated. He then stepped toward another wooden stand. He took a set of tools that had already been sterilized with alcohol and approached the wooden table where the snake lay. At this moment, Richard's gaze fell upon the snake's body, observing this strange creature capable of engulfing itself in flames with great scrutiny. The head is relatively small. Richard measured the snake's head with his hand and remarked. Opening its mouth to see no elongated fangs, he continued, non-venomous, snout flat. There are 3 pairs of labial pits. Richard's gaze fell on a part of the snake similar to a human's upper lip, where he saw 3 pairs of indentations, indicating the snake's special structure, akin to infrared sensors. These allowed the snake to detect warm-blooded animals in the environment at night, determining their exact position for tracking and attacking. Brown. Richard's eyes moved back from the snake's head to its entire body and back, noting, the back is yellowish with arrow-like markings and numerous irregular cloud patterns. The abdomen is white. With a slight effort, Richard flipped the entire snake over and looked at the lower part, where the snake's cloaca was, and saw a pair of protrusions. There are also a pair of vestigial claw-like limbs. By this measure, it resembles the Burmese python on modern Earth, likely a close relative. Having completed his observation, Richard spoke to himself, with data about the Burmese python swiftly passing through his mind. The Burmese python, also known as the Myanmar rock python, kin snake, or double-banded python, scientific name, Python bivitatus, is one of the subspecies of the Asian rock python within the snake suborder. It is the 3rd largest python on modern Earth, known for its enormous size, reaching lengths of up to 7 meters and weights of up to 91 kilograms. The longest recorded Burmese python measured 9.75 meters. 7 meters? 9.75 meters? Richard uttered aloud, looking at the snake on the table, which was just over 3 meters long, pondering, if it truly is a close relative, it must not be mature yet. But even without reaching maturity, it can emit flames up to 1,500 degrees Celsius. What would it be like when mature? Truly a magical demonized creature. The next moment, Richard took a deep breath and grabbed a set of prepared tools, stabbing into the snake's body. With a puff sound, the sharp blade easily cut through the snake's skin. With a slight force, it glided downward, slicing open the entire body of the snake, revealing all its inner contents. Reaching into the viscera to search, Richard squinted his eyes. According to many modern Earth's entertainment novels, magic creatures like this snake should contain something like a crystal core or a magic crystal in their bodies to provide energy for casting spells. And from a scientific perspective, if a snake can engulf itself in flames, it must possess special organs or glands not found in other snakes. But Richard found none of these. Richard frowned slightly, finally setting his gaze on the snake's skin. He recalled clearly that the snake skin he touched in the Pretender Wizard's package had temperature. It was evident that the snake's skin contained something special. Pressing his lips, he sliced the snake's skin and flesh apart with a knife, quickly obtaining a complete snake skin. Soaking the snake skin and boiling it for a long time, a layer of viscous, grease-like yellow substance floated to the surface of the water. This is... Without hesitation, Richard quickly scooped up the yellow substance, took an iron tray from a nearby wooden stand, and tried to ignite it. With a puff sound, orange flames leapt into the air, and the air temperature instantly rose. However, the iron tray showed no signs of being red hot. Upon touching it, it was astonishingly cold. Watching the yellow substance in the tray gradually degraze, Richard realized something. This substance present in the snake skin can seep through the scales to the surface, then ignite to produce high-temperature flames for attacking. While burning, it evaporates, taking away a significant amount of heat, maintaining the skin at a low temperature, preventing burns. This is similar to the fireproof handkerchief magic trick. The trick involves soaking the cloth in alcohol before lighting it. During the burning, the evaporation of moisture absorbs heat, lowering the temperature of the handkerchief below the ignition point of the cloth, so until the alcohol is burned, the cloth remains unharmed. So, by this measure, Richard's eyes lit up, the so-called magic material should be among this. If the water, grease, and impurities can be filtered out, what remains should be the pure magic material. Then, Richard did not continue speaking but started to work quickly. He extracted all the yellow, oily substances, put them into a jar, and began distilling them. Richard personally undertook the task, naturally much faster than the inadequate maid outside. Before long, Richard distilled out excess water from the golden, oily substance, separating the grease and other impurities, ultimately obtaining a small vial of golden yellow liquid, resembling molten gold. Is this the true magic material? Richard squinted at the golden liquid, feeling that some answers he'd been seeking might soon be unraveled. The next moment, Richard swiftly disinfected and washed his hands with alcohol, grabbed the bottle of liquid, and strode out of the laboratory. By this time, several hours had passed, and night had fallen. Outside, Edward was still waiting. Seeing Richard come out, he opened his mouth, ready to continue persuading him. However, Richard waved him off and said, "Edward, have someone clean my laboratory, then guard the palace entrance. I have urgent matters to attend to and must not be disturbed. I won't be having dinner. Any issues, wait until tomorrow." After speaking, Richard strode toward the hall, quickly ascended the wooden stairs to the second floor, and entered his bedroom and the adjoining study, shutting the door with a bang. Chapter 7. Standing in the study, Richard saw 5 or 6 tall bookshelves lined up against the wall, each filled with books and scrolls. With eyes slightly narrowed, Richard walked to one of the bookshelves, stepped on a special wooden ladder, and reached for the top of the shelf. Pushing aside a large number of books and scrolls, Richard touched a cool black iron box placed at the very back of the shelf. The black iron box was about 30 centimeters long and wide, 5 or 6 centimeters high, with intricate patterns engraved on its surface, appearing strange and mysterious. With a slight exertion, Richard pulled the black iron box from the shelf, stepped down from the wooden ladder, and placed it on the wooden table in the study. Placing his hand on the surface, feeling the ice cube-like touch, his eyes flickered, landing on a depression on the surface. The depression, combined with the metal patterns, looked like a cracked mouth. From a special angle, a barely noticeable line of small characters could be seen. "Awaken me with magic power, and I will reveal to you the truth of this world." The wizard book. Or rather, this was the shell of a wizard book. Richard had found this after considerable effort in the depths of the royal library. Its origin was a mystery even to the oldest librarian. It was known only as a peculiar book filled with evil power, carrying a malevolent curse. If frequently handled, it could make one sick at best, and cause sudden death at worst. Richard naturally didn't believe in so-called curses and evil powers. To Richard, this book merely contained a volatile substance harmful to the human body. As long as he ensured proper air circulation, he could completely avoid chronic poisoning. However, unlocking the secrets within the book was not simple. Because the iron shell outside the book had a special design, it was difficult to forcibly destroy. If someone truly forced it open, there was a high probability of damaging the real contents inside. Richard could use some methods to reduce the damage probability to a tolerable level, but he did not want to take the risk, So he had been diligently searching for demonized creatures and people related to spells, hoping to obtain magic power. Now, he had done it. Phew, Richard took a deep breath, slightly tilted his head, and looked at the golden liquid placed on the side of the table. Right or wrong, the answer will soon be revealed, won't it? Richard muttered to himself. The next moment, he picked up the bottle filled with golden liquid, uncorked it, and slowly poured it into the depression on the surface of the iron box. Before long, the depression was filled. After a moment of stillness, with a click, as if causing some chain reaction, the liquid in the depression began to boil rapidly, releasing numerous bubbles, and the entire iron shell started to vibrate slightly. Pop. 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 Then, as if some restriction had been triggered, with a gulp, all the liquid was instantly swallowed by the book, disappearing without a trace. The vibration of the iron shell intensified, like a human trembling, causing the tabletop to vibrate along with it. Finally, with another click, the iron shell opened on its own like a box, revealing the genuine wizard book inside. Richard gently took the book out and carefully placed it on the table. At this moment, a faint voice emerged from deep within the book. Who is it? Who is it? Richard raised an eyebrow and opened the book. On the first page, he saw not a word, only an incredibly terrifying skull imprinted in the center. The eyes of the skull burned with blazing flames, as if real. Whether it was an illusion or not, Richard felt the room's temperature rising sharply. In the next moment, something even more shocking happened. The painted skull began to move, its jaw opening and closing, emitting an eerie and chilling whisper. Who is it? Who on earth awakened me? Who dares to spy on Master Monroe's trove of knowledge? Answer me, or you will face the harshest punishment. If anyone else witnessed this, they might be scared half to death, but Richard was not. Instead, he squinted his eyes, watching the skull on the book's page with interest, and asked, Who are you? I am the book spirit created by Master Monroe, tasked with safeguarding this book and screening the qualifications of those who read it. What can you do? I can verify whether each reader is intelligent enough. If he is, then he will be qualified to read this book. If not, he will pay the price for his recklessness and ignorance. What price? Death. The book spirit's voice was extremely cold. Richard laughed. Interesting. Richard then asked, How do you verify if someone is intelligent enough? I will exchange a question with each person. If he can correctly answer my question and leave me unable to answer his, then he is deemed intelligent enough. During the time I can't answer his question, he is free to read the book's contents without punishment. I see. Richard's eyes flickered. So, what is your question? Do you, who wish to peer into Master Monroe's knowledge, confirm you want to begin the challenge? The book spirit's voice turned solemn. It's always worth a try, Richard said, whether success or failure. I want to study your mechanism. The book spirit was silent for a moment, appearing to ponder the meaning of Richard's words. After a while, it spoke. All right, since you are sure about the challenge, let's tackle this difficult question. There is a strange creature, which walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon. Richard couldn't help but be stunned. Wasn't this the Sphinx's riddle from modern Earth's Greek mythology? In Greek mythology, the monster with the body of a lion and the face of a human, the Sphinx, sat on a cliff near Thebes, blocking travelers and asking them the same riddle. Many couldn't guess the answer and were mercilessly devoured by the Sphinx. Later, a man named Oedipus guessed the correct answer, causing the Sphinx to plummet to her death in shame. The next moment, without waiting for the book spirit to finish speaking, Richard interrupted. Don't tell me your next line is, this creature has 3 legs in the evening. When it has the most legs, it's also when it walks the slowest and is weakest in physical strength. Then you will ask me, what is this creature? The book spirit's voice abruptly stopped, plunging into silence, a lengthy silence as if it encountered such a situation for the first time. Richard spoke again to the book spirit. All right, if this is indeed the case, then I can only tell you, the riddle is human. For humans, in infancy, morning, they crawl on 4 legs, as adults, noon, they walk on 2 legs, and in old age, evening, they walk with a cane, having 3 legs. But, is determining intelligence with merely a brain teaser type of riddle truly rigorous? Or is what you call intelligence fundamentally different from how I understand it? You lean towards cleverness, while I lean more towards wisdom. Chapter 8, Damn Brat. Like a form of revenge, the book spirit interrupted Richard's words harshly, scolding, Damn brat, you're cheating. You somehow know the riddles and the answers. You must have gotten them from others who successfully passed the validation. Although you answered correctly, your behavior is despicable and shameless. I will never forget you. Wait. Richard spoke up. You say I got the riddles and answers from others who passed the validation? So you're telling me there's only this one question you test everyone with? Silence, a long pause again, and after a while, The book spirit's stiff voice spoke. Brat, stop wasting time. State your question. Complete this validation. Alright, let me ask you. Richard thought for a moment, then said, here's a question. In the world, there are only 4 fundamental forces, namely, the electromagnetic force, weak interactions, strong interactions, and gravity. Do you think it's possible for a systematic theory to exist that unifies these 4 forces to explain all physical phenomena? If so, what is the core of this theory? Silence, the long and eerie kind. Is it impossible to verify the grand unified theory? Richard glanced at the page, muttered to himself, and speculated, is this type of Q&A too hard? Alright then, let's switch to a simpler true or false question. You only need to choose between correct or incorrect. For instance, the Riemann hypothesis, one of the 7 major problems in mathematics. In mathematics, some numbers have special properties, they cannot be expressed as the product of 2 smaller numbers, like 2, 3, 5, 7, and so on. Such numbers are called prime numbers or simply primes. Primes play an important role in both pure and applied mathematics. At first glance, the distribution of prime numbers among natural numbers doesn't seem to follow any pattern. But a man named Riemann proposed such a conjecture. The frequency of prime numbers is closely related to a complex function. That is, s equals 1 plus 1, 2s plus 1, 3s plus 1, 4s plus. Then do you think this conjecture is correct or incorrect? Silence, continued long and eerie silence. Richard couldn't help but raise his eyebrows, still unable to answer. So you can't make responses that go beyond the limits of human cognition, no superintelligence attribute, right? Still silence. Alright. Richard sighed softly, then let's switch to the simplest question, a question you're sure to know. What is the circumference of a circle in relation to its diameter? Or, to simplify it, how many times is the wheel circumference of a carriage the length of 2 spokes placed together? This is the simplest explanation for pi. According to Richard's understanding, in modern Earth history, ancient Egypt calculated pi to 3 decimal places before 1900 AD. Over 200 years before that, the great mathematician Archimedes of ancient Greece calculated pi to 5 decimal places. As long as the book spirit in front of him has this knowledge, it should be able to answer this question. Based on the accuracy of the response, he could roughly determine the current mathematical level of this world and thereby indirectly understand the entire wizard magic system. After all, whether it is spells or science, as long as it's the establishment of a complete system that conforms to normal logic, the use of mathematics cannot be lacking. With that, the next moment, the book spirit indeed spoke, but lacked the momentum it had before, seemingly answering weakly. 3. More precisely? Richard pressed on. What comes after the decimal? 3.141596. The book spirit's voice was mechanical. Hearing the other party pinpoint pi to the 7th decimal place, Richard couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. This was already the peak level of ancient China on modern Earth, possibly even surpassing it. And once surpassed, the range to be tested expanded instantly, as the precision of pi's computation was developed explosively. Around 480 AD, the Chinese mathematician Zhu Chongzi calculated pi to the 7th decimal place, and it took almost 1,000 years before anyone surpassed it. In the early 15th century, Arabic mathematician Kashi calculated pi to the 17th decimal place. Later, in 1789, a Slovenian mathematician calculated pi to the 137th decimal place. In 1948, a British mathematician calculated pi to the 808th decimal place. In 1949, it was calculated to the 2037th decimal place. By 1973, it had been calculated to 1 million decimal places. In 1989, it was calculated to 480 million decimal places. By 2010, it reached 5 trillion decimal places. Thinking of this, Richard spoke up again, pressing the book spirit. If this value is defined as comma, what is the 100,000th digit after the decimal point of question mark? The book spirit's voice stopped abruptly, as if it had never appeared. Richard immediately realized he had been too hasty, his eyes flickered, and he muttered to himself, what, still haven't reached that level of precision? Then what about 10,000 digits? 1,000 digits? 100 digits? Damn brat. The book spirit's voice sounded, trembling as if it was a machine unable to bear too high a load. This damn question of yours is too hard. Too hard, I tell you. The answer is. Ah. In the end, the book spirit let out a scream. The moving jaws of the book page suddenly froze, and the flames in its eyes solidified in an instant, just like a machine malfunctioning or a computer crashing, with no further sound. After a long while, Richard tentatively reached for the page where the book spirit was and found it cold, no longer possessing the previous warmth. Is this validation passed? Richard muttered to himself. Or did an irreparable error occur due to an overload of calculation? Richard examined the pages carefully and didn't find any special constructs, just an ordinary sheet of paper with a skull icon drawn on it. It was clear that the so-called book spirit existed within the pages in a way that he didn't yet know. The next moment, Richard shook his head, not attempting to waste time figuring out the principles of the book spirit, but instead directly turning to the following pages. Dense red writings appeared on the second page. Written at the top of the second page was something like an introduction. Listen to me, remember me, you will witness a new world, Monroe. The text on the second line, slightly larger, was the name of the book, Monroe Chapter. The third line was the actual content, the wizard's world is mysterious and dangerous. Each reader, as you read this book, a door to a new world is slowly opening to you. Richard squinted his eyes, took a deep breath, and read carefully, then didn't sleep a wink all night. Chapter 9. As the new day dawned, Richard had already gained a general understanding of the wizards described in the book and the entire magic system. According to the book, wizards were a group of people with mysterious powers who could manipulate the energies, materials, and even life in nature through special means to produce miraculous changes. Generally speaking, wizards would not actively interact with ordinary people, carefully hiding themselves, spending most of their time gathering with companions to explore ancient secrets and study more advanced spells. Of course, there was a hierarchy among wizards, from low to high, ranging from first-level wizard, second-level wizard, third-level wizard, and so on, up to the highest level 9 wizard. Generally speaking, a first-level wizard possessed special abilities that ordinary people could not resist, capable of easily annihilating an entire elite army, killing a kingdom's ruler, and leaving amidst 1,000 troops. Second-level wizards were even more powerful, capable of performing feats beyond the limits of ordinary imagination, such as turning a pebble into a living giant rock or transforming a living person into a lifeless statue. Third-level wizards were comparable to gods, possessing the ability to move mountains and overturn seas. Unleashing a spell with full force could cause a natural disaster in one place, make an area suffer from a continuous drought turning it into a desert, or incessant rain turning it into a swamp. As for level 4 wizards, level 5 wizards, level 6 wizards, the methods they wield were completely unimaginable, like creating enormous islands in the ocean to inhabit or altering the climate of an entire continent to their liking. As for level 7 wizards and above, their existence was an unproven issue, only vaguely mentioned in fragments passed down from ancient times. In short, the power of wizards was undeniable. As long as one became a wizard, even the weakest wizard, they could scorn the royal power and laws of humanity at will. Of course, many times most people did not have the talent to become wizards, and even if they had the talent, many were stuck at the level of wizard apprentices. A wizard apprentice was the level before becoming a wizard. They were not considered formal wizards. Although they could cast some spells, they were far from comparable to real wizards. While their methods were feared by ordinary people had many ways to kill them. The most important thing was that wizard apprentices often could not confront a well-trained army directly, so they had to abide by the law to a certain extent and obey the royal authority. Many times, out of necessity, wizard apprentices had to attach themselves to some noble, serving them for life. Becoming a true wizard was every wizard apprentice's desire, but obviously, it wasn't so easy to succeed. Even becoming a wizard apprentice was extremely difficult because not everyone had talent, and the odds of having it were less than 1 in 10,000. Only those with talent, less than 1 in 10,000, could undergo 3 life remolding transformations, completing the transition from mortal to reserve wizard to prepare to become a true wizard. The remaining more than 9,999 people could only choose to remain mortals forever. These 3 life remolding processes were star body projection, magic origin creation, and energy melting. And testing whether a person had talent was simple, namely. Thud. A scroll fell, crashing onto the desktop. Richard picked it up, raised it high, stared at the scroll, and then released his hand. Thud. The scroll fell again, crashing onto the desktop for the second time. His eyes flickered. Richard picked up the scroll once more, staring intently, exerting all his spiritual power to try and lift the scroll, then let go. Thud. The scroll fell for the 3rd time. Phew, Richard exhaled, closed his eyes, feeling slightly fatigued from staying awake all night. He rubbed his temples and murmured to himself, as expected, the 1 in 10,000 chance isn't so easily attained, otherwise, it wouldn't be the real world. It seems, after all, that I don't have talent, which indeed aligns with the probability theory. Assuming for now that the content in the book isn't all deceitful, the current situation is that after painstakingly deciphering the secrets of the wizard book, I am blocked from the wizard world by reality. This is quite interesting. He opened his eyes, glanced out the window, where the eastern sun had just risen, casting light on every corner of the land. Richard slightly squinted his eyes, murmured to himself, so next, let's see how thick this door to the wizard world really is. I want to try using scientific methods to see if it can be forcibly broken. If becoming a wizard relied solely on so-called talent, what would be the point? Only by relying entirely on science to become a wizard, to analyze and apply the principles of the entire magic system scientifically. Now that's truly interesting. At least this way, it might be possible to uncover most of the truths of this current world, and I could understand how I came to this damned world in the first place. Transmigration, eh? Ha, such a jocular reason from a novel. I don't need that. I need a scientifically explainable real answer. Richard stood up, facing the sunrise, stretching himself, as sunlight poured in through the window, illuminating the dust-filled air. Countless sand-like dust particles, at that moment, were gilded in golden light, dancing gracefully, floating and sinking in the light, appearing exceptionally splendid. Suddenly, the dust stirred, as if an invisible giant fist punched into it. Under the influence of the airwave, the dust scattered anxiously in all directions. Bang! 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 The door connecting Richard's study to his bedroom was knocked at that moment. With a creak, Richard opened the door, seeing Edward standing outside, with a slightly tense expression. "What's wrong? Is something the matter?" Richard asked, knowing that his personal guard captain rarely showed this expression. Edward spoke. "Your Highness, Mr. Deln has come, saying he wants to see you." "Mr. Deln? To see me?" Richard's eyebrows slightly furrowed. Mr. Deln was a thin, old man in his 60s, the steward of the Blue Lion Kingdom's king, theoretically managing all the affairs of the palace, large and small. Although just a servant, the power he held surpassed that of many court officials, even small nobles. "Just not knowing what the other party suddenly came for is vexing. I'm busy preparing to solve the 3 life remolding riddles in the wizard book. I don't have time to waste." "Where is he now?" "Waiting in the hall." "All right, I'll go see him." Richard stepped towards the door. Let's see what the situation is first. Chapter 10. Soon, Richard descended from the second floor to the first floor hall, and from afar, he noticed an elderly man in blue clothes standing there. The man was thin and slightly curious, looking at several maids operating various complex instruments on nearby tables. The maids were well aware of the man's significant authority and feared causing trouble, so they busied themselves silently, not even daring to breathe loudly. Tap, tap, tap. Richard walked toward him. Hearing the footsteps, the elderly man turned his head, and on seeing Richard, he hurriedly bowed and greeted, "Good day, Lord Richard." Richard nodded, wasting no time and directly asking, "Mr. Deln, you came to see me, is there something you need? What does my esteemed father, King of Donis, want to do?" The old man spoke, his voice slightly hoarse and hesitant. "Actually, Lord Richard, this is not an order from His Majesty." "Then it seems I have the right to refuse," Richard replied coolly. The old man's expression tensed as he hurriedly said, "Of course, Lord Richard, you are a prince and the second heir to the king. Naturally, you have the right to refuse unless it's a command from His Majesty." Just what?" Richard asked. "This is how it is." The elder sighed and said slowly, "Lord Richard, recently because His Majesty has been ill for quite a long time without improvement, the eldest prince suggested that we should reduce day-to-day expenses to find better doctors for His Majesty's treatment. Although the eldest prince only proposed it, he has indeed started to implement it. From today, he has voluntarily reduced expenses in his palace by 1/3. So, if you do not respond, Lord Richard, it may not look good for the eldest prince, and after all, this matter is for His Majesty's sake, and His Majesty. Reduce expenses to treat the king? Has the Blue Lion Kingdom become this poor already?" Richard spoke with a slightly cold tone. "This." The old man trembled, cold sweat breaking out on his face. "Naturally, it's not like this. The eldest prince may just want to express his filial piety." "Mr. Deln, there's no need to say more." Richard's cold voice rang out, "I know my dear brother, William Austen's thoughts and intentions. It's just. He is he, and I am me. Let him express his filial piety as he wishes, reducing expenses if he likes. Mr. Deln, I know you're coming to speak to me about this is out of goodwill. However, my expenses cannot be reduced for now. As you see, there are so many people here in the hall who I need to produce various chemical materials for me. If I have to make them myself, I would tire myself out with just one experiment. So, things will remain the same here, the expenses will not change. It perfectly contrasts with my dear brother's expression of filial piety. As for whether my dear brother looks good or not, what others and my respected father, King of Donis, think is up to them. This. The old man looked at Richard, wanting to say something but stopped. Richard, instead, motioned him out of the door. The old man had no choice but to bow again, exit the door, and leave the palace. Out in the palace's courtyard, the old man, with some distress, couldn't help but mutter to himself, "Lord Richard, you don't need to reduce expenses by 1/3 like the eldest prince. Even doing it by 1/10 or 1/20 would be fine as a gesture. But not even caring to make a gesture, this is." Sigh. The old man's silhouette disappeared in the square. Inside the palace, Edward approached Richard and couldn't help advising, "Prince, I think we can actually reduce a little bit of expenses. The palace's funds are slightly abundant, and the money earned from the shops you opened in the city has been left untouched outside the palace. It's a waste to leave it like that." "Why not? There's no need to bring this up again." Richard waved his hand to stop Edward from continuing. "The money from the shops has a different purpose. Some of the palace's money also needs to be reserved for emergencies. Therefore, there is no part for creating a facade. I won't even reduce a single copper coin." Alright, I'm going to the laboratory to conduct some research. You keep an eye on the palace. Don't disturb me unless it's urgent," Richard said as he walked toward a separate laboratory. Edward hurriedly reminded, "Prince, you haven't had breakfast yet." "It's fine. I'll eat when there's a breakthrough in my research." "But, you didn't have dinner yesterday either, today." Edward's words trailed off as Richard had already entered the laboratory, shutting the door behind him with a bang. With a sigh, Edward swallowed his remaining words, unable to help himself. Sigh, "Prince, you make it really hard for me as the captain of the personal guard." Richard walked into the independent laboratory, finding it had already been cleaned. The snake carcass on the table in the center, and the bloodstains from yesterday's dissection on the floor, had all been tidied up. There was a faint scent of disinfectant in the air, indicating it had been cleaned as per his specified instructions. Nodding slightly, Richard walked to a wooden shelf, took out numerous bottles, jars, and tubes, and began connecting them, finally assembling an extremely complex apparatus. He placed some whitish plant powder into the first jar and then began heating for a reaction. Richard was attempting to create a plant alkaloid anesthetic. The reason for this was to try scientifically unraveling the Monroe chapter's described challenges of the 3 stages of life remolding. According to the Monroe chapter's account, those with wizard talent innately possess potent spiritual power, which can intentionally or unintentionally affect lightweight objects, such as preventing a scroll from falling. Only individuals like this can let their bodies automatically enter a special super body state, connect with the vast universe, absorb the energy projected by stars in the universe, and complete the first remolding of life. After that, utilizing spiritual power, they put their body in a highly activated state, letting spiritual power act on the body and become highly solidified, constructing a special container called Magic Origin to store the absorbed star projection energy for later use, completing the second remolding of life. Finally, using spiritual power to let life enter a high-energy state, melting the energy stored in the Magic Origin, turning it into actual mana, which can be used to cast real spells, completing the third remolding of life. Simply put, the 3 remoldings of life are the preconditions a person must meet to cast spells. After completing these preparatory steps, one can proceed to the casting. How many steps are required for casting is a separate matter. However, if these 3 steps are not achieved, casting would be an unattainable goal. Chapter 11. It was obvious that this magic system was extremely complex, nothing like the simplicity described in novels, just sitting cross-legged with eyes closed, absorbing spiritual energy from the heavens and earth, and then releasing it whenever needed. This magic system, even with Richard following the Monroe chapter's descriptions and adding his extensive speculations, left him with a multitude of questions about many aspects. For instance, what exactly was the super body state that the first life remolding aimed to achieve? What kind of state was the highly activated state required for the second life remolding? And what state was the high-energy state for the third life remolding? To these questions, Richard could only speculate, explore, and experiment. According to some explanations in the book, the super body state of the first life remolding was a mystical state where the spirit temporarily detached from the body and experienced the wonders of the external world. It felt somewhat like a dream but with maintained self-awareness. Richard interpreted this super body state to be similar to meditation, or what is known as mantla in Sanskrit. In Sanskrit, mantla could be divided into 2 parts, man and tla. Man meant mind. Tla meant to lead the way. Therefore, mantla meant leading the mind away from all worldly thoughts, worries, desires, and mental burdens. Yet, the super body state was not entirely equivalent to mantla meditation. Comparatively, it was deeper, maintaining a relaxed self-awareness and even more detached from the body, delving deeper into the spirit, akin to the ultimate state of meditation, Zen. Or, it could be considered a form of nightmare state, known as sleep paralysis, when someone suddenly wakes from sleep, The brain regains consciousness, but the motor centers remain asleep, resulting in a phenomenon where the spirit cannot control the body. One could think and recall, but unable to move any limbs, causing extreme panic for those who experience it. Alternatively, it could be like the lucid dream many people sought, half awake, half asleep consciousness, being fully aware of dreaming and able to control and create any dream scenario, becoming like God in creation and destruction, achieving fantasies impossible in reality. Simply put, the super body state was a deep level of mental meditation, and achieving this was no easy feat. Even real yoga masters could not guarantee complete immersion into meditation at will. As for the so-called nightmares and lucid dreams, they were even rarer, with success rates less than 1 in 10, even after deliberate sleep adjustments. Such unreliability was entirely unacceptable to Richard. From a scientific perspective, only a 100% success rate could prove a method's feasibility. To make the elusive super body state consistently achievable, Richard considered relying on drugs. Admittedly, using drugs would have some impact on the body, but drugs might be the most convenient and quickest method. Normally, one could not remain consciously awake while the body slept, but with certain special drugs, such as alkaloids with anesthetic effects, it was entirely feasible. Many plants contain these alkaloids, such as those from the Solanaceae, Fabaceae, Ranunculaceae, Papaveraceae families among dicotyledons. By adding plant materials into equipment and undergoing a series of chemical reactions to remove impurities, high-purity anesthetic alkaloids could be obtained. Thinking this way, Richard set to work. Complex instruments continued their functions: distilling, condensing, filtering, precipitating, dissolving, crystallizing. PSSSSSS, a large amount of white steam emerged. Plop plop, the jar lids constantly bounced. Drip drip, yellow drops emerged from the horn tube. Gurgle gurgle, a considerable number of bubbles formed in the beaker. After a busy half-day, the entire experimental process reached its final stage, with the liquid in a beaker cooling. Crystals formed, appearing murky yellow, as if filled with dust inside. With just a glance, Richard couldn't help but shake his head, realizing this first attempt was a failure for one simple reason: impurities. His experimental process was correct, having considered various impurity removals, but the entire experiment spanned over 20 segments, and the current world's instrument manufacturing created inevitable small errors at each step. 1 error, 2 errors were acceptable, but 10 or 20 errors were problematic, with quantitative changes accumulating into qualitative changes, thoroughly polluting the final crystal product that should have been pure, making it unusable. Failed. Richard shook his head again, yet without showing any anger. Having been in this world for 15 years, he already understood its nature, knowing that no matter how strictly he demanded of craftsmen, the instruments were always flawed. The solution lay in impurity removal and purity enhancement. To enhance purity and remove impurities, an appropriate solvent, or rather an extraction agent, preferably organic, was required. However, producing organic extraction agents was no easy task. Many organic solvents required high temperature and pressure conditions. Was he supposed to figure out how to make a reaction kettle, a fractionating tower? The one easy organic extraction agent could be ether. Wait, ether. Richard's eyes suddenly squinted, as he recalled something. Ether. Yes, ether. Ether could be used as a drug extraction agent, but then again, if ether were available, what more extraction would be needed? Ether itself was a more efficient anesthetic than alkaloids. Yes, ether was an anesthetic. Ether belonged to a type of liquid anesthetics, one of the most commonly known anesthetics. Even if never seen in real life, it was often featured in films, where a villain would cover a victim's mouth and nose with a sudden cloth soaked in a volatile liquid, causing the victim to inhale and shortly after collapse unconscious. In those scenes, the liquid on the cloth was ether, a colorless, transparent liquid that highly volatilizes and acts quickly as an anesthetic. Yet preparing ether industrially was somewhat difficult due to the requirement for aluminum oxide as a catalyst, and aluminum oxide, or metallic aluminum, was much rarer in this medieval-like world, 10 to 100 times more scarce than gold or gemstones. But laboratory preparation was much simpler. Laboratory preparation of ether only required 2 materials: sulfuric acid and ethanol. Sulfuric acid was available, and as for ethanol, what was ethanol? Ethanol was the scientific name for alcohol, something he had plenty of. Using alcohol to prepare ether seemed like basic high school chemistry. Perhaps he had overcomplicated things. Richard spoke to himself, slowly standing up, his gaze landing on the instruments on the table beside him. He stepped closer, quickly dismantling the instruments, then used a large test tube, conduit, cork stopper, flask, iron stand, iron ring, and separatory funnel to assemble another set of apparatus. After completing the assembly and checking for airtightness, Richard began to load the chemicals. He poured anhydrous ethanol into the flask, then slowly added concentrated sulfuric acid, plugged in the cork stopper. Heated. Cooled. Chapter 12. After quite some time, Richard obtained about 5 milliliters of ether. This amount was only 1% of a bottle of mineral water on modern Earth, but in Richard's view, it was already enough. He sealed the glass bottle containing the ether with a cork to prevent evaporation and wrapped it with dark linen to prevent strong light from causing oxidation. Satisfied, Richard nodded, took the bottle, and walked out of the independent laboratory. Walking into the palace hall outside, sunlight shone through the window onto the ground. Richard looked up and found that the sun had already moved westward, indicating that he had unknowingly spent an entire day in the laboratory. Yet he didn't feel the slightest hunger. Instead, he felt mentally excited and was eager to return to his bedroom to test the ether he had just prepared. He wanted to see if he could really unlock the so-called life remolding, to see if the power of science could overcome the barrier of the magic system. Anticipation. While thinking this, Richard was about to step upstairs when a voice rang out. "Prince, Prince." Richard raised an eyebrow, and without guessing, he already knew who it was. Turning his head, as expected, he saw Edward jogging over. He stopped nearby, panting, and asked, "Prince, is your research finished?" "It's temporarily finished," Richard replied, then asked, "During this time, nothing happened in the palace, right?" No. Edward shook his head. "That's good." Richard nodded, turned, and was about to continue upstairs, speaking, "I have important matters to attend to now. Continue to guard the palace, and this time, unless the palace is on fire, don't disturb me no matter what happens." Then dinner. "You eat by yourself." "Prince." Edward called out anxiously, "You haven't eaten anything since yesterday. If you keep doing this, your body won't hold up." "I know my body best. Not eating for a short time isn't a problem. I'll have breakfast tomorrow, so don't worry." That's it. While speaking, Richard had already gone upstairs, disappearing from Edward's sight. Edward's expression was complex, and he couldn't help but sigh. "Prince, if you continue like this, I might not be able to continue my duties as the captain of the personal guard." Returning to his bedroom connected to the study, Richard didn't rush to try immediately. Instead, he meticulously studied the Monroe chapter again. After carefully analyzing the content about star body projection and confirming it was correct, he made up his mind. As night fell, Richard sat cross-legged on his velvet bed in his bedroom, took out the glass bottle containing ether, opened the cork, and brought it to his nose to start inhaling deeply. As air entered his lungs through his trachea, Richard clearly felt changes in his body. When he reached a boundary, he quickly sealed the bottle and placed it on the table beside him. Then he remained motionless on the bed, letting the ether quickly take effect in his body. Just after a dozen seconds, Richard felt his brain tingle slightly, and then his body began to feel heavy. After several dozen seconds, his body felt as heavy as if it were filled with lead. A minute later, he couldn't move at all, but his consciousness remained clear. Recalling the records in the Monroe chapter, Richard began to imagine his consciousness as weightless, unbound by gravity, able to float to the surface like a fish, and soar into the sky like a bird. In an instant, Richard clearly sensed his entire body starting to tremble. It wasn't from shivering due to low temperature but as if something was trying to break free from his body. He continued to use spiritual power to manipulate and control his consciousness, attempting to float out from his body. Buzz buzz. Richard felt the trembling of his heavy body become more intense, as if he were sitting in a galloping carriage on a dirt road rather than on his soft velvet bed. Something unknown felt uncontrollably about to leap from his body. Buzz 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 buzz. Unsure if it was an illusion, Richard gradually felt the entire bed start to vibrate, followed by the ground and the house, as if experiencing an earthquake. But Richard knew very well that the plains where Blue Lion City was located had no history of earthquakes, and the chance of an earthquake occurring now was nearly zero. The most likely explanation was that his body was undergoing some special change due to star body projection. Buzz 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 buzz. The vibration intensified, and Richard clearly felt his body being roughly pulled by some force. Suddenly, he discovered a multitude of lines appearing in his body. Every line pierced through his chest and emerged from his back, continuously vibrating, carrying high temperatures, threatening to slice his body into thin layers. Unbearable pain. Richard suddenly speculated that these lines might be magnetospheric lines materialized from thought. His body was oriented north-south on the bed. Assuming the current world resembled Earth, then the geomagnetic North Pole would be at his front, and the geomagnetic South Pole at his back. The geomagnetic poles are opposite the geographical poles. Thus, the geomagnetic field starting from the North Pole would extend along the ground northward, passing through his body to reach the geomagnetic South Pole. Then, Richard had just thought of this when he heard a crack sound at his ear, as if something broke, and his entire being suddenly lightened. Then Richard felt his eyes open, seeing the scene. This wasn't opening his eyes physically but rather the opening eyes of the consciousness floating out from his body. The sight seen was slightly different from what the eyes could perceive, but Richard easily discovered that his consciousness was now floating above his physical body in the form of a white mist. Yes, he was floating above himself. It was a strange experience, clearly aware that the one sitting motionless on the bed was him, yet his consciousness indeed existed in another form. Interesting. Richard muttered to himself, quickly speculating in his mind, is this a soul state? Or a plasma state? Or perhaps quantum? Due to the limited information, Richard couldn't come up with a scientific explanation for the current situation even after prolonged speculation, so he could only continue observing his surroundings with his mind's eye. Then Richard noticed something resembling a transparent band emerging from the back of his consciousness's neck, connecting to his physical body, forming some sort of link. Richard attempted to move away from his body, and the transparent band automatically elongated behind him. No matter how far he left, there was no length limitation, and it appeared infinite. Richard tried walking to the adjacent study, mentally intending to return to his body. Instantly, the transparent band on the back of his neck transmitted a strong pulling force, drawing his consciousness back to his body like teleportation. Surprisingly, to shorten the distance, the consciousness even penetrated directly through the wall. This led Richard to discover that his consciousness could disregard any tangible substances, easily passing through walls or other obstacles. Chapter 13, In That Case. The next moment, with a thought, Richard controlled his entire consciousness to float down from the bed and drift toward the bedroom door, easily passing through the wooden door and appearing in the corridor outside. Then Richard turned, dragging a long transparent ribbon behind him, and floated down the wooden stairs toward the hall on the first floor. Soon, the sights of the hall unfolded before him. Although it was already evening, numerous candles and oil lamps were lit in the palace hall, illuminating it brightly, ensuring that activities were not hindered. At this moment, many maids were busy at their respective work tables, preparing various experimental materials according to specified methods. Some were working with dilute hydrochloric acid, some with alcohol, and others with deionized water. At the entrance of the palace, several soldiers from the personal guard stood straight, vigilantly on guard. As the personal guard captain, Edward was much more relaxed, leaning against a wall, squinting at a palm-sized book using the palace's light. As he read, he was very cautious, occasionally raising his head to scan his surroundings before continuing to read. Richard controlled his consciousness to approach, and Edward was completely unaware. Then Richard saw the palm-sized book in Edward's hand, revealing words that were quite outlandish for this current world, Countess Elizabeth. So it is that kind of book. Richard thought after glancing at it, shaking his head somewhat disinterestedly. He had no interest in continuing to watch Edward, so he turned and floated toward a working maid. She was a girl about 17 or 18 years old, named Angel. Her appearance was decent, but several freckles on her face significantly diminished her beauty. However, ignoring her appearance, Angel was actually the smartest of all the palace maids, generally able to learn anything taught with just one explanation. Sometimes Richard even considered nurturing her to be his true assistant, to help manage the other maids, but due to various reasons, he had yet to implement this. At this moment, she was meticulously preparing a standard sodium hydroxide solution according to the tasks previously assigned to her. The first step she took was weighing a fixed amount of sodium hydroxide solid using a balance. Because of a reminder from Richard before, she wisely avoided using papyrus to contain the sodium hydroxide on the balance tray, knowing that sodium hydroxide is prone to deliquescence and would corrode the paper. Instead, she placed the sodium hydroxide in a beaker and weighed it along with the beaker, then subtracted the beaker's weight to obtain the true mass of the sodium hydroxide. Then the second step. The third step. Watching Angel work methodically, without making any errors, Richard nodded slightly in satisfaction. He suddenly thought of something, extending his hand toward her work table. Without a doubt, his hand easily passed through the tabletop. Richard furrowed his brow and, in the next moment, concentrated his spiritual power, feeling the hands of his consciousness becoming somewhat solid, and lightly tapped a beaker on the table. With a sudden splash, the beaker shook violently, almost falling off the table and breaking. Angel, who was working, was startled and quickly withdrew her hands to steady it. Then, with a slight furrowed brow, she looked suspiciously toward the palace door, finding no wind blowing in, and couldn't help but mutter to herself, "What happened?" Richard couldn't answer her, but from the previous action, he already knew what he could do now, influence the real world through his current consciousness, albeit with much effort and to a very slight degree. Furrowing his brow in thought for a moment, Richard willed himself, and a huge pulling force emanated from behind his neck, swiftly pulling him back toward the bedroom. In an instant, he penetrated upward through the second floor's ground and several walls, returning to the bed in the bedroom. On the soft velvet bed, Richard's body remained sitting cross-legged, motionless, his chest gently rising and falling as he maintained normal breathing. His consciousness halted beside his body, then floated down from the bed, gliding to the nearest wall, focusing all his spiritual power to carefully carve a pattern on the wall with the fingernails of his consciousness. Nodding at the pattern, Richard then remembered the main task of this test, star body projection. The separation of consciousness from the body was evidently one of the roles of star body projection, but not its core part. According to records in the Monroe chapter, the reason it was named as such was primarily because, raising his head to look upward, Richard, with a thought, floated swiftly, quickly passing through the roof, through the palace top, and landed onto the summit of the palace. Outside the palace, the night had deepened, with the profound darkness blanketing the world like a canopy. Everything around was silent, devoid of any sound, even the wind seemed to have halted, as though time had frozen. But Richard knew this was merely an illusion. He wasn't disquieted by the extreme silence, controlling his consciousness to continue floating upward, rising higher and higher, elevating to a height of 100 meters. Looking down from 100 meters high, the entire Blue Lion City lay beneath his gaze. Presently, this medieval-like world did not have the prosperity of modern Earth. Due to the expensive lighting materials, the whole Blue Lion City was mostly shrouded in darkness at this time of night, except for the palace. Only occasional spots of light appeared, and they were locations of various noble residences. Richard quietly gazed, observing the entire Blue Lion City below, feeling a slight sense of wonder. The power of a wizard? Then came the sound of flapping wings, as a black bird flew over from afar. It looked similar to a crow but was larger than an average crow. Richard recognized it as a raven. The raven flew swiftly, and while passing by Richard, seemed to sense something, twisted its neck warily to glance around, but finding nothing, it eventually flapped its wings and flew far away. Suddenly, a brief but faint screech was heard. Ah! Richard looked over and noticed the raven's figure had disappeared, with a faint large figure swiftly darting past in the distance, resembling a powerful predator. Was it a large falcon? Richard speculated, but didn't pay it much mind, retracting his gaze, calming himself, then lifting his head to look upward. At this moment, in the night sky resembling a canopy, countless points of light twinkled, but they weren't stars. They were the energies transmitted in the form of light from the stars, known as star body projection. Star body projection. Richard spread his arms open, attempting, as recorded in the Monroe chapter, to absorb the energy into his body utilizing spiritual power. In an instant, it felt as if sunlight shone upon him, with the entire consciousness suddenly warming up, and massive amounts of energy quickly flooding in, continuously, then transmitting through the transparent ribbon behind his neck into his cross-legged body. Yet all the energy entering his body was like a guest, not lingering once inside, quickly dissipating. Thus, despite the energy continuously flooding in, none of it was stored. This was precisely because his body lacked the special structure capable of storing energy, a magic origin. Constructing a magic origin was the second challenge of life remolding. The first life remolding was responsible for separating consciousness from the body to practice star body projection and strengthen spiritual power. The second life remolding enabled cosmic energy to be stored within. The third life remolding allowed the stored energy to become usable mana for spell casting. Richard contemplated the Monroe chapter's contents, expanding his consciousness in the night sky, continually absorbing energy. At this moment, it felt like lounging in a hot spring. Although he couldn't acquire any energy, his spiritual power was continuously strengthening. Thus, a consciousness floated above Blue Lion City, like a king, relishing the vast energies of star body projection under the night sky until... Chapter 14, Early Morning. The sun had just risen not long ago, the air carried a slight chill, not yet heated up. The streets of Blue Lion City gradually began to have pedestrians, merchants busy understanding the market trends, craftsmen looking for short-term work opportunities, hunters selling furs, coachmen soliciting passengers. Everyone treaded on the bluestone road, walking briskly with urgency. The windows on the second floor of the roadside buildings were opened one after another because of the lack of a proper drainage system. Basins of wash water were directly poured onto the streets. Those walking on the road, if unlucky, could get soaked unwittingly. Amidst the cursing, noise, and hubbub, the atmosphere gradually became lively. Blue Lion City, like a giant who had just woken up, stretched lazily. The Blue Lion City Palace was the heart of the giant. Compared to other places in Blue Lion City, it appeared slightly quieter and more orderly. Maids diligently cleaned the floor, gardeners carefully pruned the plants, guards and soldiers vigilantly stayed at their posts. At the left atrium of the heart, the east palace of the palace, a breakfast was taking place on a dining table. Richard sat alone at one end of a 4-meter-long and over 1-meter-wide dining table, surrounded by maids ready to serve, solitary like sailors on a shipwreck, floating alone at sea. But Richard did not say anything. After all, 15 years had made him sufficiently adapt to various lifestyles in this world, too lazy to waste time on changing such trivial things. So he held a knife and fork, maintaining a calm expression while having this medieval-style breakfast. The main course was white bread, as its name suggests. It was white in color, baked from heavily sifted wheat flour. However, the taste was not pleasant, because the fermentation of bread in this world was very incomplete. Once slightly fermented, it was placed in the oven to bake. This resulted in bread that was not soft like that on modern Earth. It was very hard. Biting into it was like gnawing on unleavened bread, severely wearing down the teeth. In fact, this was only because Richard was a prince that he could eat this kind of bread. If he were a civilian, he would be eating even worse black bread. So-called black bread, the ingredients were the same as white bread, all made from wheat flour. The difference was, to save on flour, when making black bread, the wheat flour was hardly sifted, so large amounts of bran would be mixed in, making it taste extremely coarse. Some unscrupulous bakers, to increase the weight of black bread, even deliberately added sawdust, pebbles, and such substances into the bread. At the same time, to increase the shelf life of the bread, the moisture content was minimized, leading to black bread being unbearably hard after baking, and with the passage of time, becoming harder. Generally speaking, black bread freshly made within the first 2 days could still be chewed. After 2 days, it could only be sliced with a dining knife and soaked in soup before eating. After a week, even the dining knife could not cut it, as it would have become rock hard enough to be used as a weapon. Historical records from the medieval period were not devoid of such instances. Foolish thieves, when stealing in poor villages, were accidentally exposed and beaten to death by angry farmers and farm wives wielding black bread. Of course, bread also had high-end varieties, such as the so-called queen's bread, or sometimes called the queen's bread. This kind of bread was made with fine flour mixed with eggs, milk, and wild honey, using beer yeast instead of ordinary leaven to undergo thorough fermentation, and then carefully controlling the oven temperature for baking. The size was only palm-sized, but its taste rivaled, if not surpassed, the high-end cream bread on modern Earth. However, such an item was considered a luxury more valuable than gold. Even a spendthrift king or great nobles dared not eat it recklessly. Typically it was given to those who made outstanding contributions as a special reward at banquets. The significance was akin to a medal, providing more spiritual satisfaction than flavor gratification. In summary, medieval staple food, no matter how powerful, in general, could only humbly eat the hard white bread. Richard held the knife and fork, cut a slice from the white bread, delivered it to his mouth, chewed forcefully, and then swallowed. His expression exhibited neither joy nor sorrow, really accustomed to it. After a moment, Richard swallowed down the white bread, and footsteps sounded at the dining table. A maid cautiously brought a serving tray to the table and placed it before Richard. On the tray was a fully cooked pork chop, considered one of the main dishes for breakfast, but it did not look appealing, as the cooking was not well controlled, with some parts already charred. Richard wielded the knife and fork to gently cut a small piece from the pork chop, delivered it to his mouth, chewed for a long time before breaking it down, and simultaneously a gamey flavor spread in his mouth. This was because medieval biological knowledge was really poor. Most people did not know that meat from male livestock should be castrated, resulting in the poor quality and gamey taste of meat from male livestock. Finally swallowing the pork chop, Richard quickly picked up the cup on his right side and brought it to his mouth. The cup contained the drink for breakfast. Generally speaking, in the current world, the most common breakfast drink was not water, but low-alcohol drinks. This was not due to people being fond of liquor, but because of hygiene. Yes, hygiene. Westerners from ancient to modern times never had the habit of boiling water to drink, where all fresh water lacked disinfection, teeming with bacteria. Drinking could easily cause intestinal infections. In this world lacking antibiotics, an intestinal infection would mean a significant chance of dehydration death. Comparatively, low-alcohol drinks were slightly better, cleaner than fresh water. So many people frequently treated ale or malt wine as water to drink. This kind of wine was different from beer, lacking hops, thus lacking alcoholic flavor and easily turning sour. To mask the odd sour taste, brewers often added all kinds of peculiar things, making drinking wine similar to drinking herbal medicine. Many people were indifferent to this, drinking malt wine with various flavors heartily, but Richard still found it hard to endure, so the dining table cup contained water, plain boiled water, boiled and disinfected clean drinking water. Reaching for the cup, he drank a few sips of water, rinsed away the gamey aftertaste in his mouth, and then Richard began to continue eating the sliced bread. Just after swallowing a slice of white bread with difficulty, suddenly Edward rushed in, exclaiming, "Your Highness, Mr. Deln has arrived. Didn't he come yesterday? What's he here for today?" Richard raised his head, asking aloud. "I don't know." Edward shook his head. He revealed nothing, only said he wants to see you. Ping, ping, Two light knocks sounded as Richard put down the dining knife in his hand, pondered for a moment, and said aloud, "Invite him in here." "Yes." Edward responded, swiftly went out, and soon brought the lean old Mr. Deln into the dining hall. Chapter 15. Richard raised his hand upon seeing Mr. Deln, gesturing for him to sit opposite at the dining table, and asked, "Would Mr. Deln like to join me for a meal?" "No need, thank you for your kindness, Lord Richard," replied the gaunt Mr. Deln promptly. After being declined, Richard didn't insist further and directly asked calmly, "What brings Mr. Deln to see me this time?" "Well." Mr. Deln hesitated for a moment before answering, "It's like this, Lord Richard. The eldest prince specifically brought the pharmacist today to see the ailing king." "Oh?" Richard's eyes flickered, sensing there might be more unsaid, and prompted, So, I was thinking, perhaps Lord Richard should visit His Majesty as well? After all, during these special times, the king bedridden needs some care. Besides," Mr. Deln's voice turned somber, tinged with sadness, 15 years ago, Queen Sophia gave birth to you in a difficult labor. In her final moments, she instructed me to remind you, Lord Richard, not to become too distant from the king. Now, you're preparing to persuade me to follow the example of my beloved brother, William Austen?" Richard said aloud. "After all," Mr. Deln faltered mid-sentence. "I understand you're considering my interests, Mr. Deln," Richard said, joining his hands on the table. "However, I visited my ailing, esteemed father, the King of Donis, just a week ago. As I see it, even if I visit him to express concern, it might not aid his condition. Hence, it's better to let him rest." Mr. Deln listened to Richard's words with a slight startle, then suddenly alarmed, hearing some unsettling implications. Knowing Richard often had strange yet accurate insights, Mr. Deln couldn't help but ask, could it be that His Majesty? A waxy yellow face rapidly surfaced in Richard's mind. His eyes flickered as he looked at Mr. Deln without responding. Mr. Deln's heart chilled instantly because sometimes silence signified the worst response. "Then." Mr. Deln's voice trembled slightly, "Then. Can His Majesty see the falling leaves this autumn, Lord Richard?" Richard still gave no response. Mr. Deln finally understood, lowering his head. After a moment, he lifted it again, stood up, and walked toward the dining room exit, preparing to leave, his departing figure appearing somewhat aged. At the entrance, Mr. Deln paused slightly, turned back to look at Richard, and said, "If His Majesty's condition is truly as dire as it seems, Lord Richard should indeed visit. Though a few years ago, His Majesty punished you due to false words, he is, after all, your father, correct?" "Of course, His Majesty is certainly my esteemed father," Richard replied with a smile. Mr. Deln sighed, said no more, and exited the dining room, disappearing from sight. Richard then picked up his knife and fork and continued having breakfast. Afterward, he consumed about 3 more slices of bread, half a roasted bird, a salmon, and drank 2 glasses of water, finally concluding his meal. After breakfast, Richard wiped his mouth with a napkin, stood up, and walked into the palace hall outside the dining room. Edward followed closely behind and asked, "Your Highness, are you planning to visit His Majesty?" "As Mr. Deln mentioned earlier. Let's put this matter aside until I have time," Richard replied. "Then, Your Highness, what are you planning now?" "I have a very important research experiment to conduct," Richard stated. Edward was left speechless. Richard ignored Edward and walked towards the busy maids in the hall, pointing to 2 of them. "You two, come with me to the laboratory." Saying this, Richard entered the private laboratory, and the 2 selected maids nervously stood up. One was the smartest among the maids, the freckled girl Angel, and the other was a slightly plump girl Luna, not as clever as Angel but smarter than the other maids. Both looked at each other in wonder, unsure of Richard's intentions, but obediently followed into the private laboratory. Inside, Richard was already waiting. Seeing the 2 maids enter, he directly said, "Today, I'll be doing some very tedious tasks, so I need both of you to assist me, understand?" "Understood," they quickly nodded. Richard showed a satisfied expression. The reason for calling the 2 maids was mainly to research the issues related to the second life remolding. Last night's first attempt at life remolding, using anesthetics, had achieved perfect resolution, allowing the free acceptance of star body projection energy. Solving one of the 3 difficulties marked a third of the spell's preparation completed. To proceed further, to truly release the spell, the issue of the second life remolding, constructing the magic origin, needed resolution. According to the records in the Monroe chapter, the magic origin is a very special vessel within the body, responsible for storing the special energy absorbed by star body projection. The size and shape of the magic origin can vary based on individual preference. If someone doesn't mind the hassle, they could construct a magic origin with 365 facets. However, for simplicity and stability, Many wizard apprentices construct their magic origin in a cocoon shape. Moreover, the magic origin is not singular, as it can be self-constructed with spiritual power, thus, multiple magic origins can be created within the body if desired. Yet, due to the magic origin's high energy reactions, it is critical during construction to avoid vital organs such as the brain and heart, to prevent affecting their functions. Additionally, as the energy source, the magic origin is vital for every wizard. Any damage to it can cause significant harm to the body. For this reason, many wizards prefer to destroy their opponent's exposed magic origin during combat to end the battle easily. Therefore, each wizard must carefully hide and protect their magic origin. Without equivalent strength, recklessly developing new magic origins is a waste of time and energy, increasing exposure risk, equivalent to suicide. However, for the second life remolding, the essential focus is on the conditions for constructing the magic origin. The Monroe chapter describes that, besides entering star body projection, constructing a magic origin requires an attempt to awaken the body with the consciousness, putting it in a highly activated state. The body is always somewhat activated, but generally, it cannot achieve the height necessary for magic origin construction, relying on talent for exceptional performance to reach. Once successfully entering the highly activated state, the spiritual power can officially construct the mana source. But what exactly this highly activated state entailed puzzled Richard greatly. Chapter 16. After a great deal of thought, Richard had a hypothesis, that the so-called highly activated state was very likely a charged state. In a normal human body, cellular metabolism and nerve signal transmission were accompanied by the flow of potassium and sodium ions across cell membranes, generating bioelectricity. This bioelectricity was very weak, and the voltage was generally in the millivolt range, a millivolt or MV, 1 volt equals 1000 millivolts. Although weak, bioelectricity was significant to humans. Its changes could directly cause alterations in cellular metabolism or function within the body. For example, when nerve fibers were locally electrically stimulated, the excitability at the cathode would increase, and the membrane potential would decrease, depolarization, while at the anode, excitability would decrease, and the membrane potential would increase, hyperpolarization. According to the description of constructing a magic origin in the Monroe chapter, it was very clearly about inducing some form of modification in the body structure. Among this description, the so-called spiritual power was used, which was highly likely related to this bioelectricity. Perhaps it was about increasing the bioelectric current within the body to a certain level, thereby enabling the body to develop the new organ, the magic origin, under the influence of the spiritual power. Of course, this was just a hypothesis, and whether it was right or wrong needed to be verified. The primary reason Richard called the two maids was to attempt making a battery that could release a current in this completely non-electrified medieval environment for testing. First, Richard planned to make the simplest fruit battery possible. The raw materials required only a piece of copper, a piece of zinc, a segment of metal wire, and a fruit. Because of the different reactivities of the two metals, copper and zinc, when inserted into the fruit, the zinc would undergo an oxidation reaction, lose electrons, and pass them to the copper piece, thereby generating an electric current in the wire. Because it wasn't difficult, Richard briefly explained to the maid, Angel, and let her make it. She didn't disappoint him and quickly finished the task. Soon, a thin wire connected a copper piece and a zinc piece, both about the size of a fingernail, inserted into a pair. The maid, Angel, carefully handed this fruit battery to Richard, and upon touching it, he frowned, knowing immediately that the fruit battery was inadequate. It wasn't an issue with the construction. After all, the method was so simple that it couldn't possibly go wrong. It was the fruit itself that was the problem. Because the fruit juice was acidic, it could allow the chemical reaction to proceed and produce a current. But compared to real acid liquid, the acidity of the fruit juice was too weak, thus the current and voltage generated were too small. Richard tested it using a self-made simple tool and found the voltage was less than 0.5 volts, and the current less than 1 milliampere. This current was stronger than the normal bioelectric current of a human body, but it was far too weak to influence the internal body structure. After all, the human body had electrical resistance. If the bioelectric current increased internally by itself, there was naturally no issue, but an ordinary person without the wizard's talent couldn't possibly achieve this. To influence the body by applying an external current scientifically to decipher life remolding, it would be essential to overcome the electrical resistance of up to 1000 ohms in the human body by applying a stronger current. The current issue was, how to obtain a stronger current. Richard furrowed his brow, thought for a few seconds, and began instructing the two maids to make different fruit batteries. Different fruit types had varying acidity, and thus, the current produced would vary in strength. Finding the strongest one might just bypass the body's 1000 ohms resistance and meet the requirements. Medieval fruits weren't exactly scarce. Common ones included cherries, strawberries, blackberries, apples, pears, cherries, plums, grapes, sloes, gooseberries, mulberries, blackthorn, figs, sea dates, limes, lemons, and more than a dozen kinds. With a word from Richard, people naturally gathered these fruits. Shortly after, except for those unripe due to seasonal reasons, the rest were placed on the experiment table. Richard waved his hand, and the maids Angel and Luna began making them quickly. Soon, various kinds of fruit batteries were lined up in 2 rows on the table, Angel's on the left and Luna's on the right. It was obvious that Angel had produced more. Richard didn't comment much, picked up a fruit battery to test, put it down after a while, then picked up another. Repeating this multiple times, after testing all the fruit batteries, Richard had an understanding. Because of the different acidity levels in the fruits, some of the currents generated were indeed stronger than the initial pair, like the apple and the gooseberry. The strongest was the lemon, but even so, the voltage barely exceeded 0.5 volts, and the current just over 1 milliampere. Under normal circumstances, the minimum current to cause sensations in an adult male averaged about 1.01 milliamperes. This meant that, under the influence of body resistance, this current level would just barely be perceptible to an ordinary person. This was not what Richard wanted. Richard stood in the laboratory, deeply furrowed his brow, and the 2 maids, observing Richard's serious expression, exchanged glances but didn't dare to breathe loudly, lowering their heads cautiously. Although they were well aware the prince wouldn't lose his temper easily or punish servants without reason, it was never a good thing when the prince was displeased. Richard didn't know what the 2 maids were thinking, only continued earnestly pondering a method to solve the problem. Chapter 17, How to Obtain a Stronger Current. Perhaps using other plants besides fruit to make batteries could be worth a try. For example, the famous potato clock is made using potatoes. But it seemed that potatoes did not exist in the current medieval setting. After all, according to Earth's modern history, it wasn't until the Age of Discovery after the medieval period that someone brought potatoes from South America to Europe. In this world similar to the medieval period, Richard could not be sure if it was the one from Earth's history, or if South America and Europe even existed. But it was true that there were no potatoes, so a potato clock was out of the question. Besides, even if a potato clock were made, there was a high chance it would be a dud. After all, for plants to ensure their normal growth, their acidity couldn't be too strong. It's likely that even after experimenting with all the local plants in this world, the current generated by the batteries produced would only fall within the same limited range. Given that, Richard squinted his eyes, blinking rapidly. Given that, then he would have to make a real battery, such as a voltaic pile, Baghdad battery, alkaline battery, and so on. Although he felt like slacking off, it seemed that slacking off couldn't solve the problem. Richard thought to himself, turning around to instruct the 2 maids again before starting to operate. After spending most of the day, using the materials at hand, he produced every kind of battery he could, lining them up in a big row on the table. Richard tested them and found none met the requirements. Either the current was too weak or the voltage too small. Although it could be solved by configuring them in parallel or series, the power supply couldn't be stabilized, fluctuating between strong and weak. Although he wasn't sure what effect this would have on opening Magic's source, Richard felt it was likely not a positive one. As expected, it's still not working, Richard murmured, exhaling a sigh of frustration. He shook his head, pushed open the door of his independent laboratory, and walked out. The maids Angel and Luna hurriedly followed. The other maids in the hall, seeing Angel and Luna still with Richard, couldn't help casting envious glances at the 2. However, they quickly noticed the prince's displeased expression, and Angel and Luna seemed flustered, causing their gazes to turn into schadenfreude. There was competition among the maids, and it was quite fierce. In the eyes of the other maids, Angel and Luna apparently failed to complete Richard's task, angering him, which was good news for them. Tap, 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 Richard's footsteps echoed as he crossed the hall and reached the palace entrance, realizing it was close to the afternoon. Half the day had unknowingly passed. After 3 experiments, the current problem still wasn't resolved. What could be the solution? Richard fell into deep thought. The personal guard captain, Edward, appeared, seeing Richard, intending to remind him not to forget lunch. But noticing Richard deep in thought, with his brows furrowed, Edward rationally stopped in his tracks, refraining from disturbing him. The entire world suddenly became quiet, with the guards and maids in the palace tiptoeing around, trying to avoid making any noise that might disturb Richard's thoughts and anger the prince. Richard, in this eerie silence, pondered long and hard, searching for a way to solve the problem. After a while, Richard suddenly lifted his head, looking at the square inches front of him. Flap, flap. 2 gray sparrows nearly skimmed the surface of the square. Turning his head, he looked above the palace doors. In a corner, a spider was spinning a vertical web quickly. Squinting his eyes, Richard stretched out his hand, feeling the air's humidity increase. He glanced at the sky. The sun was still out, but the clouds were thickening, and the southern sky darkened bit by bit. Is it going to rain? Richard squinted his eyes to align. Theoretically, this was normal, considering the days of scorching heat, with large amounts of water vapor evaporating into the air, having a high chance of rain. It looked like there would be a heavy downpour. And once it rained, it would be accompanied by thunder. Thunder, as a form of natural electricity, theoretically, was strong enough to alter the bioelectric current within a human body. But how to attract it down and control its use was the problem, especially since he didn't want to be struck by lightning. That would be not scientific research but suicide. In that case. After a moment, Richard turned around with a plan and addressed the personal guard captain. Edward, bring the craftsman from the palace, I have something for him. Yes. Chapter 18. As the afternoon approached evening, the sky above the palace quickly darkened, casting the entire world in a strange amber light, heralding the imminent arrival of a heavy rain. On the plaza in front of Richard's palace, a personal guard soldier held a peculiar kite crafted by a craftsman, staring nervously at the sky overhead. With a boom, a muffled thunder resounded between the clouds, and a gust of cool wind suddenly swept across the plaza. The personal guard soldier turned to look to the side and saw Richard nodded. He swallowed hard with a gulp, gathered his courage, and launched the kite. The kite was no ordinary kite, it was a lightning-attracting kite. A small chain of gold hung from it, and its string was woven with fine silver threads, with a strangely shaped bottle attached at the end. This was a method Richard had thought of after failing in 3 consecutive experiments, to capture lightning with a kite. In fact, many had such an idea, and some had even put it into practice. In the modern history of Earth, in June 1752, American scientist Benjamin Franklin, together with his son, sent a kite with a copper key into the air. When the kite was struck by lightning, the electric current successfully traveled down the kite's wire, proving that lightning was also a form of electricity. From then on, Franklin's name became famous. This is considered knowledge from modern Earth primary school textbooks, with no difficulty in execution. The only thing to consider was how to store the lightning captured. Richard's choice was the Leiden bottle, the bottle hanging at the end of the kite's rope. The Leiden bottle was developed by Dutch scientist Mason Brock in 1745 in modern Earth's history. The earliest Leiden bottle was just a glass or ceramic bottle with the inside and outside walls coated with tinfoil. The tinfoil inside the bottle connected to a metal rod inserted inside through a metal chain, with a metallic ball about 1 centimeter in diameter on top. This structure, based on the principle of capacitors, could store a certain amount of charge and release it when needed. Despite its simple structure, the current released was strong enough that during a 1748 experiment in Paris, the current from a Leiden bottle made over 200 monks holding hands jump at once. So this method was definitely up to the task. Richard thought so, looking towards the personal guard soldier. The wind on the plaza gradually picked up, and the kite in the soldier's hand soared higher and higher, reaching the sky. A flash of lightning streaked across with a whoosh, abruptly illuminating the gloomy land, and a massive blurry black shadow swept through the electric light, followed by the sound of thunder. The personal guard soldier was startled but gritted his teeth, held his breath, and controlled the kite to continue ascending. The wind howled vigorously, and flashes of lightning crossed frequently between the clouds. Suddenly, with a boom, explosive thunder roared, and a bolt of lightning struck the kite in the sky. With a bang, the entire kite caught fire, turning into a fireball, with flames swiftly spreading down the kite line. The personal guard soldier's face turned white in an instant, eyes widening. Watching the flames, his hand released involuntarily, and the Leiden bottle, dangling at the end of the string, plummeted to the ground. Edward, standing nearby, saw this and cursed, rushing forward. He kicked the personal guard soldier hard and pounced to catch the falling Leiden bottle in both hands. The next moment, Edward's eyes widened too, witnessing a blue electrical flash travel down the kite string and enter the bottle in his hands. A weak numbness enveloped his body, and simultaneously, all his hair stood on end involuntarily, filling him with immense fear of the unknown that paralyzed him momentarily. After a long while, as the numbness dissipated from his body and his hair returned to normal, Edward took a deep breath and finally moved. He glared sharply at the nearby personal guard soldier, then swiftly carried the Leiden bottle towards the palace where Richard was. As soon as he entered the palace, a torrential downpour followed immediately behind, instantly turning the entire world into a white blur, with nothing but the sound of rain pounding in his ears. Edward was slightly surprised, feeling a hint of relief, then turned to Richard and carefully handed over the Leiden bottle. "Your Highness, it is all done." Richard took the Leiden bottle, nodded lightly, and without saying more, turned around and left. Edward quickly added from behind, "Your Highness, you didn't have lunch, so for dinner you..." Before he could finish, Richard's figure was already ascending the stairs to the second floor, disappearing from sight. Edward watched, chuckled helplessly, and muttered to himself, sigh, is he going to skip meals again for a whole day? If he doesn't eat again tomorrow morning, it will truly be another full day. Being the personal guard captain is really hard. The next morning, before dawn had fully broken. Yawning, Edward walked past the palace dining hall, glancing casually, suddenly widened his eyes as he saw Richard inside, eating breakfast. This. Edward rubbed his eyes vigorously, realizing he hadn't seen wrong, and with some disbelief, he walked into the dining hall, greeted him, Your Highness, you got up so early today? Just couldn't sleep, Richard responded faintly, slicing white bread with a butter knife, spreading sour jam on it and putting it into his mouth. As Richard ate, he frowned, as if contemplating something. The test with natural lightning and the Leiden bottle failed, as expected. Otherwise, he wouldn't be sitting in the dining room eating breakfast so early. Last night, according to the Monroe chapter, Richard attempted a second scientific decryption of the life remolding. After entering the star body projection state, he worked hard to awaken his consciousness, which then released the electric current from the Leiden bottle into his body, hoping to enhance the bioelectric currents to enter a highly activated state and subsequently opening magic source. The strength of the current from the Leiden bottle was indeed sufficient, as Richard clearly felt a miraculous change in his body within a very short time. But it was only for a very short time. Because the nature of the Leiden bottle is that of a capacitor, the current is released in one go, depleted, and no more. So when the stored charge was fully exhausted, the high-energy activation state dissipated instantly, and his body returned to normal, making it impossible to opening magic source. Indeed, to truly decrypt this second life remolding, shortcuts won't work, genuine effort is necessary, Richard said to himself inside. Swallowing another slice of white bread covered in sour jam, leaving a cardboard taste in his mouth, Richard's mind was already made up. Obtaining a stable high current wasn't actually difficult, even in this medieval world, it could be achieved with simple materials. The main issue was the tedious process, which he had been reluctant to bother with too much, thus testing fruit batteries and the like. Since those hadn't worked, he could only resort to the most tedious, troublesome, and direct method now. He reached out for his cup, drank the water inside, and wiped his mouth with a napkin. Richard looked up at Edward and instructed, Bring the craftsman from the palace here? Now, here? Edward was slightly startled. Richard nodded to confirm, yes. Yes, Your Highness. Edward quickly walked out. Chapter 19, The craftsman from the kingdom soon arrived at the restaurant where Richard was. The food on the table had already been cleared away, and Richard was spreading out a long scroll on top, rapidly sketching something with a quill pen. Edward, looking puzzled, stood nearby, not daring to interrupt. The craftsman was even less inclined to disturb, obediently keeping his head down without saying a word, only occasionally sneaking glances at the scroll Richard was drawing, feeling that the prince seemed to be sketching some kind of machinery. It looked like a windmill but appeared to be more complex. Swish, swish, swish. After a long while, Richard put down the quill in his hand, glanced at what was drawn on the scroll, nodded slightly, and then turned his head to look at the craftsman who had been waiting for a long time by his side. The craftsman looked like a man in his 50s, but he was actually in his 40s. Artisans in this world didn't have an easy life, even being employed by the palace was only slightly better than being a serf. The long hours of labor had made him look quite old. His face was full of wrinkles, his eyes were deeply sunken, and heavy bags dragged underneath them as he gazed nervously. You are Hans, right? Richard asked. Gulp. Answering the prince, I am Hans, the craftsman quickly replied, surprised that the prince could accurately call out his name. His voice carried some astonishment and fear. After all, for a small person to be remembered by the prince wasn't necessarily a good thing. Richard waved his hand directly, saying, Come over here, take a look at this design I've drawn, see if you can understand it. Yes. The craftsman hurriedly stepped closer, looking at the scroll, carefully examining it. He confirmed his earlier guess and tentatively asked, This seems to be a windmill, Your Highness? Exactly, it is indeed a windmill, so can you manage to build it? I'll give you no more than 5 days, Richard said. This. The craftsman hesitated for a moment, looking at the design, estimating the workload, uncertainly replying, I think I should be able to take a closer look, confirm it before you say anything. If there's anything you don't understand, you can ask me now, and I will help you solve it. Don't wait until later to tell me there's a problem and that you can't complete it, Richard said. Yes, the craftsman said, unable to stop sweat from appearing on his forehead, and looked at the design once again. His eyes twinkled as he suddenly realized that the design wasn't as simple as he had initially thought. At least compared to an ordinary windmill, it had many parts he didn't understand. He quickly pointed at a part, saying, "Your Highness, this part seems a bit problematic. Normally, windmills are mounted on a single column, so why is this windmill installed like this?" Richard glanced at it and slowly explained, "This is the turning tower." Turning tower? The craftsman was puzzled. Ordinary windmills, indeed, can be installed on pillars. The structure is simple and easy to make. However, the downside is that they cannot always adjust to the wind direction and require manual adjustment, which is laborious and not very efficient. But according to this design, by mounting the windmill blades on a specialized turning tower, the tower can automatically rotate around the central axis to face the wind direction, allowing for the maximum utilization of wind power at all times, Richard explained. The craftsman widened his eyes in amazement. "Really? Can it really do that? But Your Highness, how does it achieve this, since the wind does not always come from one direction, it could come from any direction?" "Because this part is on the turning tower." Richard pointed to a part on the design. "Behind the main blade, there's a tail fan perpendicular to it, connected to the gear track on the edge of the turning tower. So no matter which direction the wind comes from, as long as it blows over this tail fan, it will propel the turning tower to rotate, ensuring that the wind tower's main blade always aligns with the wind direction." The craftsman scratched his head, still somewhat confused, but at least he understood one thing from Richard's words: the prince was not speaking randomly, he genuinely understood, and he understood more than the craftsman did. In that case, the next moment, the craftsman took a deep breath and asked about the next part he didn't understand, "And, Your Highness, what about here?" These two weights extending outward on the lever are the centrifugal governors. You don't need to understand the principle, just know that they can automatically adjust the rotor's speed to suit different wind speeds." Okay. "And, Your Highness, this rotor?" "This, Richard waved the quill again, crossing out the corresponding part. "This part is a bit complicated, you don't need to worry about it. I will handle it myself. It's for generating electricity and requires artificial magnets, which you can't make yet." "Okay, so, Your Highness, this part. This is an improved crankshaft used to transmit energy to drive the rotor. Pay attention here. And here, Your Highness. This is the part for storing current. I'll take care of it, you just need to reserve the relevant section." "And what about here?" The craftsman and Richard talked for more than an hour, finally clarifying all the details on the design. Wiping the sweat from his face, the craftsman said, "Your Highness, this windmill seems really difficult to make. I'm afraid 5 days." "Then make it 1 week," Richard said, his voice a bit stern, "but no longer than that, as my time is limited and cannot be delayed." This." The craftsman shrunk his neck, afraid to refuse, grit his teeth, and nodded. "All right, Your Highness, I will definitely have it done in 1 week." "Good, that's settled then." The craftsman took the design and left. In the next moment, just as Edward was about to say something, Richard looked at him first and instructed, "Edward, go find me some iron filings and some rust powder." Edward was puzzled, finally asking what he had wanted to say earlier. "Your Highness, what exactly are you trying to do here?" "You'll know when the time comes," Richard replied. All right." This answer was not much different than no answer at all. Edward shrugged and left, helplessly. By the afternoon, the iron filings and rust powder had been delivered to Richard's private laboratory. Afternoon, private laboratory. The afternoon sun shone in, extremely bright. Richard looked at the table filled with dozens of pounds of iron filings and rust powder, nodding in satisfaction. Although Edward's swordsmanship was mediocre, he did have a talent for handling tasks. According to Edward, the combined weight of the iron filings and rust powder exceeded 100 pounds. A pound was a unit of mass in the British and American systems, equivalent to 0.453599237 kilograms, or 0.90718447 jin. However, as a habit, whenever he heard others mention this British and American unit, Richard automatically converted it into the familiar units in his mind. 1 pound was about 0.9 jin, so a little over 100 pounds was 90 jin, which was indeed a lot. The reason for needing so much iron filings and rust powder was none other than to make the rotor for the windmill. This was the fundamental, foolproof method Richard had decided on for generating electric current. Chapter 20. To create an electric current, one needed to understand electromagnetism. In the history of modern Earth, on October 17, 1831, Faraday first discovered the phenomenon of electromagnetic induction, thereby obtaining the method to generate alternating current, which was considered a significant achievement in electromagnetism. The so-called phenomenon of electromagnetic induction meant that when a magnet passed through a closed circuit, an electric current would be generated within the circuit. Using this phenomenon, By keeping the closed circuit stationary and continuously rotating the magnet, the closed circuit, in its static state, cut through the magnetic field lines emitted by the magnet. This caused a continuous generation of electric current within the circuit, converting mechanical energy into electrical energy, thus becoming a simple generator. This was high school physics textbook knowledge, not considered very profound, though the realization of basic materials and components was somewhat troublesome. To keep this engine running continuously, relying on manpower was not feasible, as it was inefficient and prone to errors. Only natural resources could be utilized, either wind power or water power. Richard chose wind power and thus designed a wind turbine to be made by the craftsman. But the craftsman could only make some simple parts, such as the complex rotor, energy storage devices, and shafts, which had to be done by Richard himself, which was quite laborious. Because of this, Richard didn't want to do it unless absolutely necessary. However, since the decision was made, he had to proceed. First was the fabrication of the rotor. The main material for the rotor was magnets. Neodymium iron boron magnets, samarium cobalt magnets, aluminum nickel cobalt magnets, and iron chromium cobalt magnets would all do. But currently, in the Blue Lion Kingdom, there was no type of magnet available, so he had to make them himself. The type he chose to make was the simplest and most common one, iron oxide, Fe3O4, magnets. To make iron oxide magnets, he needed to obtain iron oxide material. And to obtain this material, there were many methods, such as the hydrogen reduction method of ferric oxide, slow oxidation method of ferrous hydroxide, Haber method, addition method, and alkaline addition method. He chose the addition method. The two most critical reactants in this method were pure iron, iron filings, Fe, and iron oxide, rust powder, Fe2O3. Richard took a deep breath, washed his hands, put on a dust mask to prevent powder from entering his nose and mouth, and began the procedure. First, Richard placed the iron filings into sulfuric acid. Visually, as soon as they were added, the beaker immediately bubbled a lot, reacting violently. In this process, ferrous sulfate, FeSO4, would be generated. After the reaction was complete, Richard began adding baking soda, Na-O, and iron oxide, Fe2O3. He then heated it to 95 to 105 degrees Celsius to allow the solution to undergo an addition reaction, ultimately producing iron oxide. However, the iron oxide at this time was not pure. Richard transferred the solution to a funnel equipped with filter paper to begin filtration. After filtering, the solid material obtained was dried, followed by a series of operations. After a considerable effort, he finally produced pure iron oxide. Then, through magnetization, the iron oxide became a real magnet, a pitch-black piece. By repeating this step, he made a sufficient number of magnets to fix them in an annular mold, thus completing the most important part of the generator, the rotor. After finishing these, Richard did not rest but began making the energy storage device. After all, the turbine generated electricity, but electricity needed to be stored to be used. This required a real rechargeable battery, not a fruit battery, much less a Leyden bottle-type capacitor. What Richard prepared to make was a lead-acid battery, which was the cheapest and most common electric vehicle battery on modern Earth. The reason for choosing it was twofold: materials were easy to collect, and the structure was simple, consisting of only the positive plate group, negative plate group, electrolyte, and container. Aside from the sulfuric acid used as the electrolyte, practically only one material was needed, or rather two: firstly, lead, used to make the negative plate group. Secondly, lead oxide in air, lead oxide, used to make the positive plate group. In the current medieval world, perhaps many things were lacking, but lead alone would not be missing. Because according to modern Earth's development, by the year 2000, humans had begun massive extraction of metals such as iron, copper, silver, and lead. Therefore, without much effort, Richard obtained sufficient lead and lead oxide. Taking a deep breath, Richard's gaze became somewhat solemn. Both lead and lead oxide were toxic. Excessive inhalation or ingestion would cause heavy metal poisoning, ranging from physical discomfort to death. In the ancient Roman era and on modern Earth, the ancient Romans did not know the dangers of lead and thus used lead pipes for water delivery and lead containers for drinking, resulting in widespread chronic lead poisoning, becoming an important reason for ancient Rome's decline. Richard was aware of this and did not want to repeat the same mistakes, not wanting to be afflicted with illness before becoming a wizard, so he took ample protective measures before conducting the experiment. He first put on a dust mask, then added a bird beak mask over it, changed into a black protective suit that covered his entire skin snugly, and finally donned gloves made from ox bladders. With preparations complete, Richard took a deep breath, feeling the air pass through the herbal pouch in the bird beak mask and fill his lungs. He focused his gaze and began the work. First, He poured a sufficient amount of sulfuric acid into the prepared container as the electrolyte. Then, he inserted the gray fluffy lead plates, serving as the anode, into the container, securing them. Next, he placed the brown lead oxide plates, serving as the cathode, securing them. Between the anode and cathode, he placed a separator to prevent the electrodes from contacting each other. Then came the continual repetition of this process, sequentially inserting lead plates and lead oxide plates into the container until the entire container was completely filled. The reason for doing so was to allow multiple groups of anode and cathode plates to act in series, thereby increasing the lead-acid battery's voltage. After completing these tasks, Richard exhaled slightly, knowing that he had finished the main work of the lead-acid battery. What followed were the trivial details of setting up the external wires, etc. piece by piece. Until evening, Richard finally completed everything. With two light thump-thump sounds, placing the completed lead-acid battery and rotor on a wooden frame, Richard turned to take off his gloves, removed the bird beak mask, took off the dust mask, and shed his protective suit, realizing that his whole body was soaked through. After all, it was a hot summer, even in the relatively cool palace, working an entire afternoon was extremely taxing. He hadn't noticed it while working, but upon completion, Richard felt the inner clothing clinging to his skin, and the stickiness all over his body. Frowning slightly, Richard pushed open the door and walked out of the independent laboratory. Chapter 21. The night was serene and tranquil, a hemispherical starry sky suspended over the earth, stars twinkling like a cradle inset with gemstones. Blue Lion City lay sprawled on the plains, most of it darkened, like a sleeping child lying still. Occasionally, a flicker of light would appear, not from the startled eyes of a child awakened from sleep, but from the palace of Blue Lion City. Palace, hall, bath. A massive bath barrel was placed in the center of the bath, with Richard lying inside with his eyes closed. The bathwater filled most of the barrel, maintaining a temperature of about 45 degrees Celsius. This level, slightly above normal body temperature, allowed Richard's skin pores to expand gently, letting his whole body relax bit by bit, yet not too hot during the summer heat. A few maid-servants stood several meters away, waiting for orders. Further away, in the corner of the bath, a maid was heating smooth cobblestones over a fire. Once they were red hot, she used tongs to place them into a nearby bucket full of water. Sizzle, accompanied by the hot cobblestone, the water in the bucket roiled violently, releasing large amounts of steam that dispersed into the air and then condensed into tiny droplets as it cooled, turning into a white mist and releasing heat. The mist hovered, keeping the entire room at bath temperature, and the maidservants began to perspire but dared not move or speak, afraid of disturbing the prince. Suddenly, Richard opened his eyes in the bath barrel. A maid cautiously asked, "Prince?" Richard responded. "Yes," the maid nodded, a flash of light in her big eyes as she quickly walked over to Richard. Reaching the bath barrel, she bent down to take a porcelain jar from a bamboo basket, pouring a bath oil made of herbs and rose petals onto her hands and rubbing it evenly. Standing up, she gently placed her hands on Richard's body, carefully applying the bath oil and massaging, helping to relieve Richard's fatigue. Richard closed his eyes again. After several minutes passed, feeling his muscles relax a lot, Richard waved his hand gently. The massaging maid understood and whispered, "Yes," then retreated backward. With a splash, Richard stood up, stepping out of the bath barrel onto a non-slip wooden board on one side, silver water droplets rapidly rolling off his body and wetting the floor. 3 maids quickly approached, one carrying a bucket, pouring water over Richard's body from behind. This time, the water was a cooler 30 degrees Celsius, not too cold for Richard, but causing his expanded pores to contract slightly, tightening the relaxed muscles and skin, invigorating his spirit. Another maid used a large dry cloth to quickly wipe Richard's body. Once he was dry, the last maid stepped forward to assist Richard in dressing in fresh clothes and boots. Once everything was complete, Richard stepped out of the bath. The remaining maidservants swiftly cleaned up and then left in sequence. The night deepened, and the palace lights gradually dimmed, except for a few persistent ones. In the northwest corner of the palace, there was a row of low houses that clashed with the palace's overall architectural style, where the craftsmen and male servants lived. At this moment, in one house, an oil lamp flickered as Hans, the craftsman instructed by Richard, squinted at the design scroll spread on the table, his nose almost touching the scroll. After a long time, old Hans furrowed his brows, staring at a part of the design and repeatedly saying, "What's going on in this area? Why can't I understand it? This is terrible. I didn't ask Lord Richard about it back then, and if we can't make it, then..." With a worried expression on his face, old Mark turned and left the house, heading to the shed outside. Inside the shed stood a wooden rack assembled by him in a day, a crude model of the turning tower. Reaching out to a part of the model, old Hans muttered to himself, "Still can't figure it out, what's this part supposed to do? Placing it here, How on earth can it not interfere with rotation? For a long time, old Hans couldn't make sense of it, feeling somewhat despondent as he walked back into the house, looking at the design scroll with a hint of despair. Suddenly, his eyes sparkled as he discovered a faint, nearly imperceptible note at the part he didn't understand. Wing panel.axle.gear. Old Mark read out loud, his eyes gradually lighting up, instantly solving the puzzle. But then old Hans furrowed his brows again, perplexing himself. I recall, this part didn't have markings before. How did they suddenly appear? Or have they always been there, and I just didn't see them? Strange, and nobody came in. No one dared to touch Lord Richard's things either. This. Old Hans looked around the room, quiet and empty, then peered at the doors and windows, which stood motionless. This. All right, no matter what, I understood it, so I should get to work quickly, old Hans muttered, exiting the house to head into the shed, working through the night. After all, the 1-week deadline set by Richard was still tight for him. Chapter 22, at the same time, in the very center of the palace where the king's palace resided. The palace, the bedroom. Within the enormous bedroom spanning nearly 60 square meters, numerous candles and oil lamps were lit, illuminating the place brightly. However, this brightness did not bring much vitality. Even in this hot summer night, the entire room still appeared eerie and cold. A luxurious wooden bed was placed in the middle of the bedroom, as lonely as a canoe drifting in an ocean. On the bed lay an elderly man with a face full of wrinkles, the king of the Blue Lion Kingdom, Danzō Austin. At this moment, Danzō's face was pale, and the exposed skin was an eerie black in color. Some areas were already decaying, even though ointments had been applied, a faint stench still lingered. A thin blanket covered his body, his chest heaving, nose and mouth struggling to breathe, and the life force of the sleeping King Danzō appeared weaker than the flickering candlelight beside him. Suddenly, cough. The sleeping King Danzō jolted awake, opened his eyes, and felt a suffocating sensation. A thick phlegm clogged his throat, making him want to cough but unable to. His face flushed red. Under the loose skin, veins bulged as he exerted himself to sit up, trying to attract the attention of others to help him. But the 2 guards standing at the bedroom door seemed to have turned deaf, allowing His Majesty to pound on the bed, making bang sounds, standing motionlessly in place. Under the swaying candlelight outside, the shadows of the 2 guards cast onto the bedroom floor slightly twisted, like souls struggling after being tempted by demons. Bang, cough. King Danzō continued to pound on the bed, his fists clenched tightly, knuckles whitening, and veins bulging on his temples as he opened his eyes wide. His mouth opened, yet he couldn't breathe any air, like a fish tossed onto the shore by waves. Then, at that moment, King Danzō suddenly felt a heavy blow on his back as if someone had struck him. His whole body jolted, his throat loosened, and the clogged phlegm was coughed out onto the floor. Wheezing. Danzō began to take deep breaths, his chest heaving violently, making the sound of an old bellows being pulled. At this time, the 2 guards outside the bedroom finally heard the noise and stepped forward to come in. However, a figure was faster than them. It was Mr. Deln, the palace butler. He had been stationed outside the bedroom, but due to his age, he couldn't stay awake and dozed off. Awakened by the commotion in the bedroom, he hurried in to check on the situation. Seeing Danzō sitting up, leaning over and gasping for air, with sticky saliva still dripping from his mouth onto the blanket, Mr. Deln immediately understood the reason. He approached, gently patting Danzō's back, causing him to cough again and expel the remaining phlegm from his throat. Using a handkerchief to wipe Danzō's mouth, he then cautiously asked, "Your Majesty, are you all right?" "Barely. Still alive," Danzō said, panting as he replied. "In that case, Your Majesty, should you continue resting?" "Forget it. Now that I'm awake, I might not be able to sleep anymore tonight." Danzō waved his hand, his face, tormented by the strange illness, appearing particularly pale at this moment. He spoke, "How about you chat with me about what's been happening lately? How are my 2 sons, William and Richard? They haven't caused any trouble, have they?" "No," Mr. Deln shook his head, "both princes are doing well. Eldest Prince William took the initiative to cut palace expenses, saying it's to find a physician to heal you, Your Majesty. Yesterday morning, the eldest prince even came to see you, but since you were finally asleep, he didn't dare disturb you, and he left. He also reminded me not to mention it to you, lest you get disappointed." "Well, William is indeed good," Danzō nodded, then asked, "What about Richard?" "Second Prince Richard." Mr. Deln hesitated slightly and said, "Lord Richard is also very concerned about you, Your Majesty, but he's been busy recently, so, since his last visit, he hasn't cared about me anymore, is that right?" Danzō spoke, slowly closing his eyes as if calming himself. "Your Majesty." Mr. Deln spoke softly, Perhaps Lord Richard is still upset with you. After all, you did indeed wrong him several years ago. Donis opened his eyes, remained silent for a moment, and then spoke slowly. I was impulsive about the matter 3 years ago, but if he hadn't been involved in those strange affairs related to sorcery, how would I have misunderstood? Since it happened, what can be done? Should I, the king of a kingdom, apologize to him and ask for his forgiveness? Even if I apologize, I doubt he would accept. By the end, Donis's face showed a trace of anger. Your Majesty, please calm down, Mr. Deln hurriedly said. Naturally, Your Majesty cannot apologize to Lord Richard, however, it's possible to punish those who fanned the flames back then. It is said that the news initially came from an attendant in Prince William's palace, and then... Let's not bring that up. Donis waved his hand. The reasons behind it, William has already explained to me in detail, and it wasn't the attendant's issue. A few years ago I made a mistake, so must I make another mistake to make up for it? Richard. Let him endure it. After all, I am his father. I can't, for the sake of fairness, chill William's heart, can I? Moreover, is there fairness in this world? You should know, I have high hopes for William. Whether in demeanor or approach, he's far superior to the younger me. I believe that entrusting the Blue Lion Kingdom to him will make it more prosperous, and as the next king, he mustn't have any blemishes. As for Richard, after enduring some grievances, William will compensate him later with the best fief and tax exemption. He should be pleased. After all, the matter earlier ended up being a misunderstanding of a few people close to him, confining him for a while. The ones killed, which he claimed were valuable assistants he nurtured with great effort, I saw as nothing more than ignorant peasants and bumpkins, not even considered fine maids. They were killed, and in exchange for a lifetime of wealth, what is there to be dissatisfied with? Even he needs to endure it, for I'm his father, and the king of this country. Everything on this kingdom's land is my property, and everyone must obey me. I am not dead yet, so I do not allow anything against my will to exist. I do not wish to hear any negative voices. Yes, Mr. Deln dared not refute, only replied with gleaming eyes, but... Your Majesty, isn't it a bit early to say these things now? Hey. Donis laughed, seeing through Mr. Deln's thoughts, and said, Don't worry, I understand my health condition. Though this strange ailment torments me and my body weakens day by day, I can still hold on for now. Speaking of which, when the birch trees outside the city turn yellow come autumn, I still wish to see them. Ah, that's good, Mr. Deln said repeatedly, his expression somewhat complex as if something crossed his mind. Engrossed in conversation, Donis did not notice Mr. Deln's unease and continued talking. During their chat, a candle ignited in a corner of the bedroom burned. The candle core lengthened as it burned, making a crackle sound, causing the flame to gradually become unstable. Suddenly, an invisible force appeared, snapped off a section of the candle core, and the flame became stable again. Neither Donis nor Deln in the bedroom noticed this, nor did they observe an invisible pair of eyes gradually leaving the palace and rising into the sky. Deep in the night, the darkness intensified. The night sky was filled with resplendent stars. A transparent invisible tether floated in the air, with one end connected to Richard sitting cross-legged in a bedroom in the Northwest Palace, while the other end linked to Richard's star body projection in the sky. The energy from the star body projection spread in various colored light spots. Richard extended his consciousness, beginning to absorb and assimilate the immense energy. Although, without opening a magic source, the absorbed energy couldn't be stored, it helped him familiarize himself with the process and strengthen spiritual power. In the distance, a massive figure, unlike any bird, quickly swept by. Chapter 23, a week later. An oddly shaped wind turbine stood behind Richard's palace. A gust of wind blew, and the turning tower atop the wind turbine automatically adjusted, making a creaking noise. The main blades mounted on it aligned with the wind direction and began to spin. Mechanical energy transmission. Swoosh, swoosh. The rotating blades drove a magnet rotor below through gears and crankshafts. A metal coil surrounding the rotor continuously generated current, which flowed downward through metal wires. Mechanical energy was converted into electrical energy. Below, a simple yet practical lead-acid battery was fixed, absorbing the current to store it, ready to release it when needed. Electrical energy was then transformed into chemical energy. Nighttime. Richard's palace, bedroom. Richard sat cross-legged on the bed, in front of a lead-acid battery filled with stored electricity. With his eyes tightly shut, Richard, who was in deep meditation, felt his body vibrating rapidly. Then, like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon, his consciousness burst out of his body. Using the eyes of his consciousness to look at his physical body, Richard attempted to summon spiritual power to gain control over his body. Having done this many times before, it was easy for him, and soon, the body sitting cross-legged began to move. His hands slowly raised, reaching for the two external wires of the lead-acid battery. Crackle! At the moment his physical hands touched the wires, his body, acting as a conductor, formed a closed circuit with the lead-acid battery. The current flowed out of the battery and surged rapidly through his body. The sensation of being electrocuted spread throughout his body and was transmitted to Richard's consciousness through the transparent band on the back of his neck, feeling numb and burning hot. The bioelectric current in his body started to significantly increase, and his body cells entered a highly activated state. Richard recalled the content of the Monroe chapter, simultaneously remembering while gathering spiritual power. When spiritual power was concentrated to the extreme, it became a semi-physical, minuscule substance, resembling a grain of dust. Controlling this grain of spiritual dust, he guided it towards his heart, fixing it in place, and then gathered another grain of spiritual dust to stick together. This process was akin to swallows building nests and was a time-consuming endeavor. According to the Monroe chapter, opening the magic source was crucial for wizards, often taking tens of days or even months to accomplish. The longer it took and the larger the magic source constructed, the more mana, energy, it could store, allowing for the release of more spells. Of course, since a magic source could be constructed, it could also be modified. Many wizards initially opened a small magic source, only to find it insufficient later, prompting them to modify and enlarge it. However, the process of modifying a magic source was not much easier than opening a new one, so some wizards instead continued to open new magic sources as their strength increased. It's said that the most powerful wizards possessed more than 10 magic sources, and their mana was virtually inexhaustible. Of course, possessing more than 10 magic sources, and how to perfectly utilize the mana in each without causing conflicts, was also a big concern. However, for a wizard who had not yet entered the discipline, apprentice wizard, the consideration was evidently a bit premature. While Richard pondered, he continued to condense spiritual dust, slowly constructing his first magic source. After working busily for an entire night, he had barely built an area smaller than a fingernail, far from forming a complete magic source. However, Richard was not in a rush, knowing he would patiently keep building for a long time in the future. Thus, as days went by, the magic source gradually took shape, eventually forming a standard diamond shape at the center of Richard's chest cavity. Following this, Richard faced the wizard's third life remolding, energy melting. According to the explanation in the Monroe chapter, the purpose of energy melting was to convert the energy absorbed through star body projection into the purest standard energy, known as mana. Simply put, due to the distinct nature of different stars, the energy projected by them was a chaotic mix of various types. Even if stored in the magic source, it was difficult to utilize without undergoing melting to transform into unified mana used to release spells. To carry out energy melting, the third life remolding, the body needed to be in a high energy state. During the process of opening the magic source, Richard had numerous suspicions about this high energy state, with the most probable being magnetic field. The Monroe chapter described that both the second life remolding and the third life remolding involved energy covering the whole body, showing certain similarities but not entirely the same. Considering the relationship between electricity and magnetism, this third life remolding was determined. With the determination, it became easy to deal with, simpler than the first and second life remoldings. Because of electromagnetic induction, electricity and magnetism were inseparable. Magnetism could generate electricity, and electricity could generate magnetism. Arranging metal coils around the bed in the bedroom, a magnetic field naturally formed when the current from the lead-acid battery flowed through the coil. Therein, Richard clearly sensed the energy stored in his mana source being refined, eventually transformed into mana. At this point, the three barriers to becoming a wizard, the so-called three life remoldings, were all scientifically broken. The door to releasing spells suddenly opened. Half a month later. Late at night. The entire Blue Lion City had fallen asleep, and the palace was also utterly silent. Richard's palace, bedroom. Tonight, instead of meditating, Richard stood by the window, pondering something unknown. After a while, he turned his head, his gaze landing on the Monroe chapter lying on the bed, open to a certain page, recording a zero-circle magic spell. Zero-circle magic. According to the Monroe chapter, spells could be categorized into zero-circle magic, first circle magic, second circle magic, third circle magic, and so on, corresponding to different wizard levels. Among them, wizard apprentices could release zero-circle magic and occasionally release weaker first-circle magic. A first-level wizard released first-circle magic, and in an explosive state, could release some second-circle magic. A second-level wizard usually released second-circle magic, and in desperation, could release some third-circle magic. And so on. Each circle of magic was further divided into 3 levels, low level, middle level, high level. Obviously, the higher the circle of magic, the stronger the spell's power and the more challenging it became. In fact, The power of first circle magic alone was already considered terrifying, with the highest level first circle magic comparable to modern Earth's missiles in power. Zero circle magic, however, was the lowest level of magic, most of which lacked destructive power and could only play some indirect roles, such as lighting, opening doors, repelling enemies, alerting against wild beasts, and so on. The weakest presence in zero circle magic, low-level zero circle magic, was often referred to by wizards as trickery. The spell Richard was looking at was considered such a trick, named Phosphorus Candle. Coret. Plas. Teak. Anise. Obscure incantations were uttered from his mouth as Richard slowly extended a hand. The next moment, his magic source within vibrated, mana surged forth, coursing swiftly through the veins and undergoing some specific transformation during the process. As the speed increased, the mana became active, similar to boiling water, and the passage through the veins brought a distinctly scorching sensation. Richard's palm trembled, and the active mana flowed along the radial artery, entering the palmar veins to reach the fingertips, and then burst forth. Richard's 5 fingers on his right hand twitched violently, causing 5 small, bluish flames to appear with a pop, burning quietly. The 5 fingers came together, and the 5 flames fused into a single flame, burning more fiercely, illuminating the whole bedroom. The forest blue glow made the atmosphere in the room eerie, adding a hint of coldness to the sultry summer night as if the air had suddenly dropped several degrees. Phosphorus candle, phosphorus combustion? So, the flame's color is blue? Richard muttered to himself as he carried the flame to the window, looking outside where there was no one. With a flick, he tossed the flame from his hand, watching it fly through the air. Its size quickly expanded from a fist to that of a basin, then to a bathtub. The flame, more than half a meter in diameter, bathed the ground in front of the palace in a ghostly blue, unbelievably bizarre. Just as it was about to expand further, it extinguished with a puff, vanishing without a trace as if it had never existed. The personal guard Captain Edward, standing vigil at the palace entrance, suddenly looked up, his eyes flickering. It felt as though he glimpsed something extraordinary out of the corner of his eye, but after scanning the surroundings, he saw nothing. Did I see wrong? Edward shook his head, refocusing on the palm-sized book in his hand, revisiting the knowledge he had learned. The Countess Elizabeth chuckled. Suddenly. Glug. Inside the bedroom, Richard sensed a unique energy wave dissipating outside the window. He looked at his hands, which bore no burn marks, with his eyes slightly aglow. A spell, a real spell? Is this pseudoscience that defies explanation by science, or is it unexplored science not yet discovered by modern Earth? But regardless, it seems the legends of wizards in this world are true. In that case, I'm all the more eager to understand the truth of this world, to figure out how I came to this world. Interesting. Closing his eyes as if savoring something, he opened them again after a while, nodding seriously and speaking aloud. Truly interesting. Chapter 24, The next day, the King's Palace. Sunlight streamed in through the window, casting into the bedroom. On the bed in the bedroom, King Donas lay in a fitful slumber under a thin blanket. After a while, Donas opened his eyes, staring vacantly at the ceiling, his eyes occasionally wandering. As his mind gradually cleared, he turned his head to the side. Mr. Deln was standing there, raspingly asking, "William and Richard, are they here?" "They're all here, and they've been waiting outside for a while, Your Majesty," Deln answered quietly. Donas listened, closed his eyes, as if he had fallen asleep again. After a long while, he reopened them, slowly sitting up from the bed, and said to Deln, "Let them in." "Yes, Your Majesty." Deln immediately walked briskly to the bedroom door, and momentarily returned with the 2 princes following behind. Leading in front was Prince William, dressed in ordinary clothes, with no sense of grandeur. His eyes carried a tinge of sadness as he quickly walked to Donas's bedside, half knelt, and greeted, "Father, are you feeling better?" Richard walked calmly behind, his face devoid of any emotion. He approached King Donas and said, without any discernible emotion, "Honored Father, King Donas, greetings." Cough, cough. Donas coughed several times, his complexion far worse than it had been over a month ago. He first grasped William's hand, patting it, then looked at Richard and said, Do you hate me this much, to remember what happened 3 years ago for so long?" "Not at all." Sigh. Donas sighed, somewhat helpless, saying, "Pour me a glass of wine, and then stand with your brother, William. I want to talk to both of you." Richard's eyes flickered briefly, but he said nothing. He stepped to the side of the bedroom, took out a cup and poured half a cup of wine. Sunlight from the window illuminated the cup, revealing fine black particles swirling before settling to the bottom. Richard brought the wine to Donas, noticing the extended hand, whose skin was deeply pigmented, appearing as if tinged with pigmentation, with corn-sized bumps on the palm. As the hand was raised, its deep color turned pale, then purplish, then flushed, before returning to its original deep color, classic Raynaud syndrome. Watching the black particles settle to the bottom of the cup, Richard handed it to Donis, saying, "You'd better drink less of this wine, my dear father." William turned his head, somewhat puzzled, and said, "Brother, what are you saying? Father is ill, racked with pain, only wine can relieve it. How can he drink less?" "Indeed, William is right," Donis said, raising the cup to his mouth and taking a gulp. He caught his breath before speaking. "Without this wine, I couldn't bear it today. By the way, I owe much to William, the wine he brought tastes far better than any I've had before." Richard said nothing, only shaking his head slightly. Donis lifted the cup again, drank the wine within it heartily, his complexion appearing slightly better as the alcohol numbed his senses, improving his spirit considerably. He looked at William and Richard and said, "Initially, I thought I might survive this winter, but my illness has worsened recently. It's likely I'll meet your mother sooner than expected. I summoned you today to entrust you with some matters. The Blue Lion Kingdom, though small with only a population of tens of thousands, is still a nation. Therefore, I wish to entrust it to the capable hands of William. It's not that I deem you inferior, Richard. Cough, cough. But clearly, your interests lie elsewhere. So, come this autumn when the Baiwa forest outside the city turns yellow, I will leave the city, move there, and meet my end there, to be buried there. At that time, William will inherit my throne. As for you, Richard, you will be made a duke, with a large territory. As long as you don't cause trouble for your brother, you'll live in peace." Raising a hand to stop William from speaking, Donis closed his eyes, concentrated his spirit again, and slowly said, "Do not refuse, this is my already made decision. However it turns, I hope that after my death, both of you will live well, maintaining this country well." Additionally, a long moment after, the two princes, William and Richard, having heard what seemed to be King Donis's final words, left the palace. Outside the palace, their personal guards had been waiting for a long time. They immediately followed, and the two men quickly broke into two separate groups. The sound of footsteps echoed on the palace's square, the two groups walking silently to the end, heading in opposite directions. Suddenly, William stopped, turning his head to look at Richard, and called out, "Richard. Brother." Richard stopped, showing an inquisitive look. At this moment, William's eyes still held an indelible sadness, and he spoke with a somewhat depressed tone, "My dear brother, with father like this, I believe neither of us is in good spirits. If one day father really passes away, the Blue Lion Kingdom will have only us two royal family members left. We two brothers haven't sat down and had a good talk in a long time. Today, I invite you to have dinner with me in my palace. Although I have recently been economizing to find a physician for father, leading to simpler meals, I hope you won't mind." "I don't mind." Richard shook his head calmly, then calmly said, "But I don't have time." "Well, we'll talk some other time, my dear brother, Prince William, goodbye." Richard waved his hand, turned, and left, with his personal guard following closely. Edward, as the captain of the personal guard, glanced warily at William. William stood in place, watching Richard's group fade into the distance, and couldn't help but shake his head with a bitter smile. "Your Highness." A voice came from behind William. It was his personal guard captain, unlike Edward, not a noble, but a loyal soldier. At this moment, he spoke with slight anger, "Your Highness, Lord Richard was too much. You clearly had good intentions, yet he—" The personal guard captain's words abruptly stopped because William was staring at him coldly, eyes like knives. "Prince. Your Highness, you. Remember one thing," William said deliberately, "no matter what Richard does or says, he is still my brother. Besides father, only I may judge him, no one else can. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Good, then go back," William said. "But Your Highness, with Lord Richard not attending dinner, should the kitchen continue to prepare?" the personal guard captain asked softly. Recently, William had said to economize and had been following through, eating only breakfast, lunch, and a simple dinner, consisting of a white bread and some jam. Today, however, to invite Richard, though not overly lavish, William had the kitchen prepare something a little special. But clearly, Richard not attending the dinner would largely be. Unexpectedly, William spoke, "Let the kitchen continue preparing. My dear brother isn't attending, but perhaps other guests might come." "Ah. Don't ask more." "Yes," the personal guard captain quickly said, lowering his head. Chapter 25, Nighttime, in Prince William's palace, the dining room. On a long dining table, the candle flames flickered, making the entire room appear dim. Prince William sat quietly at one end of the table, as if waiting for someone. Suddenly, with a creak, the dining room door opened, and a figure stepped inside. Due to the dim light, the person's face was indistinguishable, but from the silhouette alone, it was evident that this was a handsome young man. "Your Highness." The figure walked in, quickly attempting to greet, the voice exceedingly respectful. William raised a hand to halt the formalities, and softly said, "Sit down, I've been waiting for you." According to etiquette, the other person should have sat at the opposite end of the table, but William gestured toward the seat close beside him. The figure hesitated slightly, then apprehensively sat next to William. William clapped his hands, and immediately a maid entered the dining room, bringing the prepared food to the table, a simple fare of white bread, pork chops, half-cold roasted hare, mushroom soup, and malt wine. The two began to eat, the process somewhat silent, the atmosphere slightly oppressive. William said nothing, focusing solely on eating as though it required 100% of his attention. No matter the taste of the food, he chewed it earnestly, then swallowed. The figure beside him seemed somewhat tense, although also eating with noble standard etiquette. The pace was painfully slow, cutting a pork chop into small fragments, sending one piece at a time to the mouth. In the oppressive atmosphere, beads of sweat trickled down the face. Suddenly, as if recalling something, William placed his knife and fork lightly on the table, causing a gentle tap, and turned to look at the figure beside him. The figure gulped down all the food in the mouth rapidly, placing the cutlery down at the same hurried pace, meeting William's gaze. "Your Highness." William spoke, "You should be quite familiar with my brother, correct?" "His Highness, Lord Richard?" Of course familiar," the figure cautiously replied. "Then what do you think kind of person my brother is?" Well." The figure hesitated, pondering a long time, preparing words. "From what I understand, Lord Richard is very intelligent, but also quite peculiar, always researching things related to wizards or conducting various experiments. In short, appears completely different from you, Your Highness." "Indeed." William nodded, as if in agreement, his eyes flickering. "Richard. My brother, he is indeed very intelligent, very peculiar. In fact, he's been like this since childhood. You should know I'm 2 years older than him. But you certainly didn't know, he was fluent in speaking and communicating with others at the same time as I was, when I was 3 and he was 1. The figure's face showed surprise. "Of course, in reality, I don't know these things myself, considering being so young, who would remember? These were all things Father told me. Father also mentioned that my brother exhibited many strange behaviors in childhood, such as never crying or laughing, utterly unlike a child, as if someone else's soul was hiding in that little body. He learned to read quickly, studied quickly. By 6, the court tutor could no longer teach him. Afterward, he frequented the library the most. According to the librarian, even Richard's reading speed seemed faster than ordinary people. Others were truly reading, while he was merely flipping through the pages. Crucially, after flipping through, he remembered everything very firmly. I recall when I was 10 and he was 8, Father tested us one day, and... Do you know what happened?" William looked at the figure, who shook his head in confusion. A glint appeared in William's eyes. The result was, I didn't even have a chance to think. Essentially, Father's question wasn't even finished, and he already answered. Finally, Father asked how to be a good king. Looking back, if he gave Father a satisfactory answer, perhaps Father would have directly established him as crown prince. But do you guess how he responded? The figure shook his head again. He said. William smiled complexly. He said he couldn't be bothered to answer that question. He said that being a king was a troublesome affair, and he had more important things to do, couldn't be bothered with becoming a king. The figure didn't know what to say. William shook his head, as if talking to himself. Do you know how I felt back then? Surprised. And also fearful. Because I suddenly realized, this brother is actually far superior to me. If he wishes to do something, he would do it better than I could, but he simply doesn't want to, as though he had already foreseen the result. My brother's peculiar person, peculiar prince. Especially after Father's test, even more peculiar, starting all kinds of experiments, researching wizard-related things, creating all sorts of frightening objects. Like acid liquid capable of easily corroding sharp iron swords, or stones thrown into water causing a massive booming explosion. No one knows what he wants to do, nor what his purpose is. In the end, even Father was somewhat fearful of him, otherwise, 3 years ago, there wouldn't have been that misunderstanding. At this, William sighed lightly, looking at the figure. I called you here not for other reasons. I want to be a good brother, to protect his safety, irrespective of what he does, as long as it's not too excessive, to let him have his way. At the same time, I wish to be a good king, to protect this country properly. So, William's gaze became serious. The figure straightened up, the next moment hearing William say, you must do something for me, and that is. The figure's expression changed rapidly. After a long time, Resolute, replied, yes. Nighttime, Richard's palace. In the bedroom, Richard flipped through the Monroe chapter, his eyes constantly shimmering, occasionally revealing thoughtful expressions. Although he successfully cast the first spell yesterday, he was not even regarded as a level 1 apprentice currently. A wizard apprentice has 3 levels: first level apprentice, second level apprentice, third level apprentice. Only after reaching third level apprentice and successfully advancing was one considered a wizard. Currently, he merely just entered the wizarding world, just the beginning. How to proceed with the remaining path still needs exploration and decision. Furthermore, relying solely on one wizard book to decipher the entire world was plainly impossible. He needed to acquire more wizard-related things, even to encounter actual wizards and magic creatures in this world. The road is long and arduous. I shall seek upwards and downwards, Richard muttered to himself. The road was long, but Richard didn't think he couldn't complete the task of scientifically analyzing spells. Even if spells are miraculous, they must conform to chemical and physical principles. Surely shouldn't freeze someone with flames or burn someone with ice cubes. Even if not conforming to chemical and physical principles, then at least they must fit within logic and mathematics. Surely spells couldn't be random. Shouldn't 2 identical spells combined be less powerful than one? If truly like this, Archimedes, the leader of logic and geometry, would really use a lever to tilt the planet. Or as a math master and circle maniac, Archimedes wielded a big stick and directly slaughtered the Roman soldiers, preventing him from drawing circles. Anything unknown may appear mysterious, just like things that exceeded one world by far often were deemed as magic, but it always adheres to certain laws, and these laws are science. Science is not some immutable entity, more so a way of thinking and a world view. What Richard genuinely wanted to do was unravel the science within the spells, understanding the reason for his arrival in this world, comprehending everything. Transmigration, conquering the world, this phrase was merely for hearing pleasure, only upon happening would one realize how unreasonable it was. If like ostriches, as described in many novels, choosing not to heed, pretending everything was normal to live, persuading oneself to be assimilated by the world, living according to the ways of this world or striving under its constraints to become the strongest, obviously was a choice. But Richard did not want this. To Richard, that was no different from artificial insects raised in a box. Being futile was an insect, striving hard, becoming stronger or even the strongest, still an insect, still inside the box. What Richard wanted was to understand what was going on with this box, why he ended up in this box, then to step out. The reason for becoming a wizard wasn't fundamentally wanting some earth-shattering power but figuring out what this pseudoscience completely absent from modern Earth was about. Understanding its core principles, mastering, and utilizing them. Even the strongest wizard remains a wizard, remains the insect in the box. Unearthing all principles, stepping out the box will become a god. This is a qualitative difference. After all, living in the box, one will never know if something will crash onto the box the next moment, directly obliterating the entire world. The road is long. Richard muttered to himself, so I mustn't waste time, must proceed swiftly. Chapter 26. In no time, more than a month had passed, during which everything remained calm. Prince William continued to be frugal, King Donaz was still entangled with a severe illness, and Richard persisted in studying the spells in the Monroe chapter. After some time of studying, Richard finally learned several zero-circle low-level magic spells besides the phosphorus candle, namely, Flame Impact, Water Droplet Condensation, Wind Barrier, Wind Repel, Wind Light Spirit, and Wind Force. Flame Impact emitted a ball of flame that struck the enemy, causing damage. Richard tested it, and its power was roughly akin to a sudden burst of flames from a wok. It could indeed inflict some burns if it hit a person, but killing someone with it was beyond its reach. After all, zero-circle low-level magic was really akin to tricks, with generally weak power. Its greatest function was not in dealing damage but in causing panic. By the standards of this era, an ordinary person seeing someone suddenly conjure a ball of flames would be as shocking as a modern-day person seeing someone pull out a firearm. Water droplet condensation gathered moisture from the air, creating droplets around. Simply put, it was similar to small-scale low-altitude artificial rainfall, or one might say water vapor condensation. Combined with the aforementioned flame impact, it was sufficient to solve the problem of making fire and obtaining drinking water for people living in the wild, but as for attack power, apologies, none. Wind barrier, wind repel, wind light spirit, and wind force all derived from the same source. Just as flame impact was a fire magic spell and water droplet condensation was a water magic spell, these four were all wind magic spells. According to Richard's study, they all use the movement of air to achieve certain effects. For example, gathering air to swiftly form an impenetrable air wall to block attacks was the wind barrier. For example, gathering air to crash into an enemy like a strong wind, making the enemy uncontrollably retreat, Was the wind repel? For example, gathering air to enhance the lower limbs, increasing speed and jump height while reducing weight, thereby becoming more agile. Was the wind light spirit? For example, gathering air to enhance the upper limbs, amplifying explosive power to deliver an unexpected strike. Was the wind force? Richard learned these spells partly for their effects but primarily to attempt to study the internal mechanisms for achieving these effects. Fiery flame impact was obviously the combustion of fuel, complying with the law of energy conservation. Water droplet condensation involved cooling liquefaction, obeying the laws of thermodynamics. The 4 wind spells fell into the category of fluid dynamics, adhering to principles like the Brandl-Gleiert rule, the Carmagian formula, etc. Richard endeavored to explain these spells using scientific methods, then remastered them, with the outcome being that Richard's spells were not as rigid as those recorded in the Monroe chapter. For instance, Wind Barrier, documented in the Monroe chapter, was merely an air wall about 1 meter long and wide, and over 30 centimeters thick. But Richard could create a super compressed air wall 2 meters long, 2 meters wide, and 2 meters thick. He could even transform it into spherical or cylindrical shapes. For another example, Wind Repel in the Monroe chapter recorded the use of fixed volume compressed air to launch an impact at an enemy, resulting in a repelling effect. Yet, after scientifically deciphering it, Richard could choose to use more or less compressed air to achieve the desired effect. He could even stack several wind repels together, transforming them into strong wind repel or even extreme wind repel. Admittedly, these were still zero-circle spells, but Richard could make them play a larger role. Richard believed that if the research continued, much more could be achieved. In the blink of an eye, another month passed. When the first yellow leaf fell in the Baiwa forest outside Blue Lion City, King Doniz's black coffin was being carried out of the city. The weather was continuously rainy, just like the day he died. 3 days earlier. The sky was overcast, and a silky autumn rain fell, hitting people with bone-chilling cold like needle pricks. This signified the end of the hot summer and the sudden arrival of autumn. From the morning, perhaps because of the weather, the entire kingdom felt somewhat dull, brewing something amid the stillness. The falling autumn rain and a sudden drop in temperature drove people indoors, making the vast palace exceptionally cold and silent. Richard was conducting experiments in this silence. A beaker was placed in a water bath for heating, and the boiling water produced bubbling sounds, large plumes of white steam rising. Richard watched from the side, then heard faint waves of sound coming his way. The first wave arose from the king's palace, accompanied by sudden cries of sorrow and panic, quickly spreading throughout the palace and then to Blue Lion City. Knock, knock, knock. The door of the independent laboratory was knocked hastily. Richard frowned, and shouted, "Come in." Immediately, Edward stumbled in, followed by the old butler Deln, his face full of sorrow. Prince, bad news." Edward spoke between gasps. The old butler Deln behind him spoke, "His Majesty." Without waiting for him to finish, Richard raised his hand and said expressionlessly, "I know." Then, "Let's go." "Yes." The old butler Deln turned to lead the way. Richard glanced at the liquid still heating and eventually followed them out of the laboratory and out of the palace. Through the cold autumn rain, across the square, and into the king's palace's bedroom. Richard saw that it was now empty. The wine cabinet in the corner was empty, and some furnishings had been removed. A bed was placed in the center, with King Doniz's corpse lying on it, his skin a dark purplish hue and already lifeless for a while. At the window stood another person, who received the news earlier, Prince William. His head rested on the bed, his shoulders shaking, no sound being made. Whether he laughed or cried was unclear. As if hearing the sound, William raised his head to look, tears on his face. He said to Richard with a hoarse voice, "Brother, father. He's gone." Richard responded, neither joyful nor sorrowful. William visibly paused, seemingly surprised by Richard's calmness, wanting to say something, yet did not, turning to lean back against the bed repeatedly saying, "Father. Father." Richard just stood beside, watching as if watching a joke. Moments later, the funeral master arrived, beginning to tidy King Doniz's appearance, which included trimming hair, cleaning the body, and donning clothes and armor. The rest of the attendants also started to set up the mourning hall, covering or taking down mirrors with black cloth, extinguishing the fireplace, opening all doors and windows, unlocking all locks, untying all knots, lighting candles. Under these circumstances, William and Richard had to leave the room. At the palace entrance, the two stood. A gust of cold wind blew, and William tightened his clothes, turned his head slightly to glance at Richard, his voice still hoarse, said, "Brother, father is dead, we." Richard did not respond, just looked at the continuously falling rain and said, "It's getting colder, dress warmer." Surprised, William reacted momentarily, feeling as though Richard was kindly reminding him, nodded in agreement. "Ah. When the rain falls." Richard continued, as if there was more to the sentence, yet did not finish. Shaking his head, he directly stepped into the increasingly dense curtain of rain. "I'll be there for the burial," said the voice from the rain. Watching, William's lips parted a few times but ultimately closed, saying nothing. Chapter 27, 3 days later. The sky was dark, heavy with clouds, and the rain fell incessantly. The earth was dark, dull and lifeless. The coffin was black, carried by soldiers, heading towards the cemetery outside the city. Behind the coffin followed a long procession. Leading it, of course, were the two princes, William and Richard, followed by nobles of varying ranks from Blue Lion City, and lords hurriedly arriving from across the Blue Lion Kingdom. The atmosphere was solemn as the crowd trudged along the muddy road in silence. All around was the cold patter of rain upon the ground. Mourning King Don is for no less than 3 days, lowering the temperature by more than 10 degrees. White breaths exhaled constantly from the crowd. It was destined to be a torturous funeral. The funeral continued as the procession reached the cemetery. Surrounded by vast yellow leaves in Baiwa forest, the coffin was carefully lowered into a dug grave in a clearing within the forest. The priest began to recite the eulogy, dirt sprinkled into the grave, followed by flower petals. "You now have been prepared for burial, the time of departure has come." Swish, swish, swish. "You have fought the good fight, finished the race, and kept the faith." Swish, swish, swish. "Henceforth, the crown of righteousness is bestowed upon you, unmatched glory remains." Swish, swish, swish. "The world will remember your greatness, the earth will preserve your body, the sky will embrace your soul." Swish, swish, swish. "You shall become eternal." Swish, swish, swish. As the eulogy went on, the grave was slowly filled in. Soldiers brought large pieces of sod to ensure that plants would grow over the grave and it wouldn't become a barren spot. After this, the attendees stepped forward one by one to place the flowers they carried on the tombstone, soon transforming the whole cemetery into a colorful display. The funeral drew to a close. Some closed their eyes before the tombstone, whispering memories of King Donis during his life. Others quietly departed. Prince William stood by the tombstone throughout. After placing a bunch of flowers, someone slowly approached him, leaned in, and whispered, "Prince, everything is ready." William's gaze turned to Richard standing afar. He did not speak. After a long pause, he murmured, "Link, do you think I will be a good king? Do you believe I will do better than my father?" "Of course." The other replied assertively. "Is it just you who thinks so, or does everyone?" Prince William asked. "Prince, it's everyone. Everyone believes you will be more outstanding than King Donis," the other replied. "Phew." William exhaled, his eyes flickered, then he turned his head towards the other person and simply uttered one word, "Good." "Yes." The other's eyes lit up brightly. The funeral ended, and Richard returned to the palace. Personal Guard Captain Edward, along with the entire personal guard, escorted Richard back. Upon entering the palace, Edward paused, looking at the empty hall, and couldn't help but speak, where is everyone?" The maids who usually filled the hall, preparing various experimental materials for Richard, were all gone. Richard spoke flatly, "I gave them all a long holiday." Edward was still puzzled. Richard walked into the laboratory, Edward followed closely. Richard took out a black wooden box, began placing various experimental reagents and some small experimental instruments inside. While busy, he spoke, "My honorable father, King Donis is dead. My dear brother, Prince William is to become the new king, so I must leave as well." "Prince, are you going to the fief?" Edward asked, probing. To be honest, Richard's fief had not yet been decided. Packing up now seemed premature. Richard replied indifferently, "Since I am leaving, I should travel light. Those I can't take, let them go." Richard continued packing. After tidying up the laboratory, he moved to the bedroom upstairs, Edward still following. Putting the Monroe chapter and several scrolls into the box, suddenly chaotic footsteps sounded outside the palace, not just a few or a dozen, hundreds. Hundreds of soldiers surrounded the entire palace. Richard glanced out the window, unsurprised, and continued packing. However, Edward's eyes contracted sharply, breathing somewhat rapidly. He said, "Prince, these people seem to be Prince William's. Seems Prince William intends harm on you." The next moment, without waiting for direction from Richard, Edward shouted aloud to all the guard soldiers, "Secure all the palace entrances, do not let them break in, protect the prince's safety." "Yes." Personal guard soldiers, filled with tension and panic, commenced action, firmly securing each entrance of the palace. In the bedroom, Richard's face remained unperturbed, placing item after item into the wooden box. Edward watched Richard calmly, but couldn't help speaking out, "Prince, let me cover your escape. Though I don't know why Prince William does this, there's a chance to break through while there aren't many of them yet." Don't rush, wait a moment, Richard said, turning around, his back to Edward, took several books and scrolls from the bookshelf. Edward looked at Richard's back, stunned, then his facial expression grew complex. He took a long breath, eyes flickering, teeth biting through his lip, blood seeping, hand resting on the hilt of the longsword at his waist. Over a month ago. In Prince William's palace, a simple banquet was underway. William spoke while next to him, a figure listened intently, features indistinct in the dim light. Suddenly, William's tone turned grave. I called you here, actually, for no other reason. I want to be a good brother, protect his safety, no matter what he does, as long as it isn't excessive, to comply with his wishes. Meanwhile, I also want to be a good king, and properly protect this country. Therefore. The figure trembled, leaning forward, revealing his face in the candlelight, a head of gold-like hair, the face of a 20-something-year-old man, full of goodwill, a face seemingly able to dispel all malice, with a terribly serious and reverent expression. Edward Angel. If I must choose between being a good king and a good brother, I'd choose the former. Originally, there's no conflict between the two, but my brother is so intelligent, to an extent that frightens me. He has no passion for power, doesn't want to become a king, so I have the opportunity to become king. But if one day he suddenly becomes interested? Father wanted me to allocate him a large fief, granting him sufficient freedom. In such a case, I wouldn't know what he's doing in his domain. I'm truly afraid that, one day soon, I'll awaken to find he's arrived at the city gates with a powerful army, even possibly breached the palace, with a long sword at my throat. I believe he would kill me as easily as one might kill a chicken, without blinking. He's cold-blooded, always has been. Calling me dear brother, addressing the father as your majesty. Behind his polite facade is intense detachment. I feel he never regarded himself as a brother or son, but as a stranger. Indeed, this stranger has done nothing outrageous, everything according to protocol, but I still cannot be at ease. His indifference to life genuinely terrifies me. 3 years ago, when blood flooded his palace, his expression never changed, he merely watched calmly. Those 6 months of imprisonment, too. This person is truly terrifying. Furthermore, 3 years ago, I personally orchestrated the event. Who knows when he'll ascertain this and seek revenge? Phew. So, you must perform a task for me, which is seek the opportunity to kill him. I'll create opportunities for you, but you must also strive. Once you succeed, then your family's double-sided wager will be forgiven and forgotten. I will ensure your family's safety and interests. In any case, do a good job. Moreover, Mia asked me to convey her greetings to you. Edward's expression shifted several times, then he resolutely replied, yes. Chapter 28. The long sword was drawn out silently, bit by bit, 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, 10 centimeters. Suddenly, the drawn longsword was retracted. Richard finished tidying the bookshelf, turned around, and looked at Edward. Edward showed a puzzled expression. Richard said nothing, only watched with interest. Edward, struggling to hold back, slowly spoke, Prince, you. What are you doing? Do you know, Edward? Richard asked. What? In my eyes, you're a typical medieval noble. Ah. Edward was stunned, and after a moment, lowered his head. No, I'm just your loyal guard captain. Say what you will, but no matter your identity, you will always put your family's interests first. Edward hesitated. Richard waved his hand, saying, there's nothing wrong with that. It's because of nobles like you, constantly striving, working hard, even sacrificing for a family, that a family can successfully rise. It's a sentiment worthy of greatness, but the problem is, you're not smart enough. Edward's lips moved slightly, his expression a bit flustered. Over a month ago, you took leave saying you needed to return to your family, and I granted it. But I know you didn't leave the palace, you went to William's palace. Edward's eyelids twitched suddenly, panic set in. At William's banquet, you agreed to William's request, to find an opportunity to kill me, and William promised to ensure your family's interests wouldn't suffer any loss, Richard asked. However you look at it, it's a win-win deal, but the question is, do you think William would keep his promise, especially after you've killed me? Why do you think the Crown Prince's battle has caused nobles large and small to pick sides so eagerly? It's because they all know that the victor can feast on the loser's spoils, thus strengthening themselves. Your family is betting on both sides, thinking itself smart and safe, but in reality, neither side sees you as confidants. When you kill me, you'll also be branded a traitor. Do you think William will choose to help your family against attacks, or slightly push you, tossing your family onto the dining table of those greedy nobles who've been backing him all along? Even if William truly kept his promise and vowed to protect your family, do you think a new king can do whatever he wants? Really do as he pleases? He only truly commands a few hundred soldiers, while the private armies of Blue Lion City's nobles are dozens of times that number. When those greedy nobles prepare to enjoy the fruits of their victory, can he stop them? Edward was completely flustered, his hands trembling. Prince. I was wrong. I shouldn't have listened to William, shouldn't have considered hurting you. You indeed were wrong. Richard shook his head, but not in wanting to kill me. It's because your family has liked to play smart from the beginning. In Crown Prince politics, it's better to choose a side randomly or remain absolutely neutral than to try and leave spots in both camps. Crown Prince politics is gambling. Have you ever seen a guaranteed win in gambling? So, no matter how hard you try, your family's outcome won't change. A strategic mistake can't be remedied with tactical effort. From when your family chose to support me as the Crown Prince, sending you to me as the personal guard captain, and at the same time sending your sister to William, the current situation was decided. All I can say is my condolences, for foresight and wisdom are truly hard to come by. Alright, I must leave, and of course not to my territory, for I never intended to from the beginning. I will leave Blue Lion City, leave the Blue Lion Kingdom, and then see what this world is all about, study and understand its principles. As for you and your family, strive. Struggle, maybe there's a glimmer of hope. After speaking, Richard picked up the heavy box and walked out directly, seeming not strained at all. Edward stood dazed in the bedroom, his body lowering, eventually collapsing to the floor, covering his face with his hands and shaking all over. Suddenly, Edward lifted his head, showing an expression of some despair mixed with madness, murmuring, "What if William was telling the truth? What if?" With a shing, the long sword was drawn. Edward stood up ready to walk out. But suddenly, he stepped back. With a creak, the bedroom door opened. Richard, who had left, returned. With a thud, the heavy wooden box was placed on the ground, and Richard looked at Edward, speaking slowly. "Initially, I thought I would leave calmly. But as I walked downstairs, I realized there's still one thing I can't let go of, and that is betrayal." Edward's eyes narrowed suddenly, the next moment reacting as if provoked, he roared, "I didn't want this either. But my whole family has half its fate resting on you. What can I do? Now, I must try to salvage it. How many times did I advise you, if you really listened to me and did things properly, with your ability, you could definitely surpass William. Then I wouldn't have to betray you. But when have you ever listened to me? You're always researching strange things, studying wizardry, and what has that gotten you besides the torture 3 years ago? Even if I don't kill you, what then? Can you really get away? Huh? Damn it, before, when the family made me and that hybrid Mia choose, I should have chosen to go to William's side. Not come to you. Then everything would be different. The one betraying you would be my hybrid sister, Mia. I don't care if she's alive or dead. Don't care." Richard smiled, a dangerous smile. "I'm truly sorry, my dear personal guard captain, Lord Edward. Sometimes reality is just so cruel, making one wrong step means nothing can be undone. I hope if your family ever gets another chance, they can act more wisely. Of course, if you were truly dead set on my side, there could have been some compensation. I actually have some plans to remedy your family's losses and arranged a decent position for you. However, your loyalty didn't reach that level. So, only the worst result remains." As he spoke, Richard quickly approached, his lips moving swiftly as if chanting. Edward looked at the unarmed Richard, breathing heavily. The next moment, he gritted his teeth, preparing to swing his sword down. "It's all your fault, it has nothing to do with me." But then, Edward saw Richard wave his hand toward him, a powerful current appeared, like a sudden gale in the room, crashing into him. Even clad in iron armor, under the force's power, he staggered backward, barely able to keep from falling. Spell, wind repel. This. Edward was shocked, while Richard approached again, his lips still moving rapidly. Edward gripped the longsword tightly, about to stab Richard's abdomen, but then his eyes widened. He felt the longsword slicing through the air as if entering a mass of viscous liquid, seeing Richard right in front of him, yet no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stab through. Even pulling out the longsword became extremely difficult, the weapon was stuck by some mysterious force. Spell, wind barrier. This. Edward's worldview began to collapse, but Richard was already beside him, his hands gently pressing on his shoulders, then pinching his head. "Do you know, Edward, why I didn't want to engage in the Crown Prince battle? It's because I have really important things to do. And this thing is quite interesting, just like what you see now. That's why I apologized, instead of regretting, since the path I chose, I would never regret. I hope you can as well." Farewell, my personal guard captain, Lord Edward. Crack. Edward felt an irresistible force on his neck, twisting his entire head 180 degrees suddenly around to his back. Spell, wind force. Is this what my back looks like? Thought Edward as his vision quickly darkened, thump, falling to the ground, breathless. Richard looked at Edward's corpse, his eyes flickered, then slowly exhaled before turning around and walking toward the bedroom door. Chapter 29. When Richard descended the stairs into the first floor hall, all the personal guard soldiers were still guarding the various entrances and exits with extreme vigilance and tension, fearing that those outside might suddenly storm in. After all, they numbered just over 20, facing an enemy force several times their size, which would be hard to withstand. They had no idea what had just happened in the bedroom nor why the current situation arose, only that they guarded something unknown while earning meager wages at the risk of their lives. One personal guard soldier saw Richard appear and hurriedly approached, speaking quickly in a low voice, "Your Highness, the people outside likely have ill intentions, with many archers aiming at the palace entrance. Your Highness, you must not appear in their line of sight, or else it may be dangerous. By the way, where is Captain Edward?" At the end, the personal guard soldier asked in puzzlement. Richard looked at him, his eyes flickering as he said, "Your captain has betrayed me, and I have killed him." "What?" The personal guard soldier's eyes widened instantly. "This. To speak frankly, even your captain betrayed me for half of his family's interests, actually." Richard said softly, "You, as his subordinates, need not protect me anymore. It's unnecessary and meaningless, you should disperse." The personal guard soldier opened his mouth wide, unsure of what to say, but he finally gritted his teeth and said, "No. I will always protect your highness, unless I die." "Why? Is it worth it?" Richard asked. The personal guard soldier hesitated, as he wasn't a noble, just a farmer's son who couldn't read and thus couldn't articulate his reasoning. He panted, I don't know, but I do understand that leaving the prince now is wrong. I don't know why Captain Edward betrayed your highness, but I won't betray your highness, even if it means death." "Bill," Richard said. The personal guard soldier shook all over, more surprised and astonished. Until today, he hadn't spoken with Richard, never expecting Richard to call his name accurately. He quickly responded, "Yes. I have a task for you," Richard said calmly. "Yes, your highness, I will accomplish it." The personal guard soldier struck his right fist to his chest, kneeling with one knee and speaking aloud. "You are now the captain of the personal guard. In the palace kitchen, there is a tunnel leading outside the city. Although it's a bit low, people can pass through it. Later, you will lead all the personal guard through the tunnel and escape. Don't rush to refuse, I know you are more loyal than Edward. But the highest loyalty isn't dying for it but striving, humbly, and arduously to live for it. A senseless sacrifice holds no meaning. If you are truly loyal, then escape and survive. Perhaps many years from now, I may find you again and ask for your service. I hope by then you haven't forgotten me." The soldier named Bill widened his eyes at Richard. Then your highness, won't you come with us? Taking the tunnel is rather tiring, I prefer to leave through the main entrance. Of course, don't worry about me, I have my own plans. Also, I want to have a word with someone, Richard said, lightly tapping the personal guard soldier on the shoulder before turning to walk outside the palace, his gaze sharpening. Outside the palace, spears were densely arrayed, swords drawn and tents, filled with a murderous aura. However, when all the soldiers saw Richard emerge, they were slightly stunned, showing bewildered expressions. This seemed somewhat inconsistent with the orders they had received. Richard observed this, then spoke, "William, come out. If you don't come forward, your men won't dare to act. After all, I suspect you absolutely wouldn't let them kill the prince, but rather the traitorous captain of the personal guard, would you?" With rustling, the crowd parted to either side, and the new king, William, in an exceedingly luxurious robe, stepped forward. The robe shone gold, with colorful patterns embroidered all over and embedded with many gemstones of varying sizes. At this moment, William's expression was not angry but carried authority. After stepping out, he regarded Richard for a moment before suddenly smiling slightly. "My dear brother, you actually came out alive. This means Edward. He betrayed once more? Not only betraying you but now betraying me too? Well, I'm a bit curious about how you persuaded him," William said, squinting. "Simple. I killed him," Richard said calmly. William's eyes narrowed slightly, though his demeanor remained calm. "So, you knew of his betrayal in advance? Which means, you were prepared for him, and then had the rest of the personal guard soldiers kill him. That would be logical, after all. Given his swordsmanship, He could hardly defeat an ordinary personal guard soldier. But I do admire your sharpness and intelligence. But speaking of which, no matter how smart you are, you never expected today to happen, did you, my dear brother? William's tone shifted slightly. Actually, I foresaw it long ago. Richard still maintained a calm demeanor. No. Not possible. William denied, enunciating each word with open eyes. Hey, Richard said, do you need me to explain it to you again? In fact, I know far more than you think. For instance, the rumors from 3 years ago, I am well aware that you spread them. You instigated our respected father, the former King Danzō, to suspect me and create a voodoo doll curse on him. The massacre throughout the entire palace, almost killing everyone from top to bottom. Over 100 lives, blood-stained the plaza in front of the palace. Then my 6 months of imprisonment. Hey. I think, back then, you were certainly very proud and assured, believing I would no longer be qualified to contend with you. Even if I wished to contest with you, our respectful father, King Danzō, would have reluctance in his heart toward me and wouldn't let go. But the thing is, from the beginning, I never intended to compete with you. I said, I have something very important to do. Though, 3 years ago, it did solidify my resolve to leave. Frankly, if I weren't a prince but an heir to a small noble in this world, things might be a bit better. The role of a prince is somewhat high, attracting much attention, with many imposed responsibilities. I don't like these responsibilities. To better achieve what I want to do, leaving is the best choice. I will leave the palace, leave Blue Lion City, leave the entire Blue Lion Kingdom. William said nothing, looking at Richard, his expression somewhat strange. You. After a long moment, he took a deep breath and said in a deep voice, even if you say this, I still will not let you leave. Chapter 30, Of course I knew you wouldn't let me leave, Richard said, because if I leave, you won't have a perfect excuse. If I'm not mistaken, you're planning to first accuse me of killing Edward out of betrayal to besiege the palace. After killing me, you denounce that I poisoned dear father, the former King Danzō, out of old grudges from 3 years ago. This way, you can explain all your actions and become the sole master of this Blue Lion Kingdom. William's expression stiffened a bit, looking at Richard as if seeing him for the first time. A trace of panic flashed across his once calm face. You. How did you? How do I know? Haha, because you were too obvious. From a long time ago, I knew that the former King Danzō didn't die of illness but was poisoned. The poison was in the wine you sent, and it was arsenic, that is, arsenic trioxide. However, I think you should execute the pharmacist who did this because he was too sloppy. The arsenic he used wasn't pure at all. Generally, arsenic trioxide is colorless and tasteless, considered an excellent poison. Due to the current lag in world technology, during extraction, some sulfur and sulfur compounds inadvertently mix in, which can blacken silverware, but that's no big deal. After all, the former king didn't like using silver cups. The issue is, the arsenic mixed in the wine was not only adulterated with sulfur and sulfur compounds but also with elemental arsenic. This led to the former King Danzō also showing very distinct symptoms of arsenic poisoning along with arsenic trioxide poisoning, skin pigmentation, Raynaud's phenomenon. I don't know how careless your pharmacist was, but here's a kind piece of advice, never take his medicine when you're ill. Then you knew, why didn't you stop me? Do you hate him that much? William asked. Are you, as the murderer, pointing fingers at me, the bystander? Richard countered. William was speechless. Alright, let me explain briefly, Richard said, continuing. I knew you killed the king because of your ambition, you can't wait to become the new king. And I didn't intervene because I have no feelings left for him. Yes, no feelings. I knew you were behind the massacre 3 years ago, but the king's handling also made me cold, showing me a man's stubbornness, ignorance, arrogance, and unrepentance. Have you ever heard of the concept of the original family, referring to the family a person is born and grows up in? In a good atmosphere, where parents are rational and positive, it's beneficial for the children's growth. In a bad atmosphere, where parents have many flaws, children are affected. This influence lasts a lifetime. For instance, overbearing parents inevitably lead to timid children, and overly controlling parents produce children who cannot stand on their own. Often, children believe it's their fault, breeding inferiority. The scariest thing in this world is that parents don't need to pass any test, regardless if they're qualified. Thus, becoming a prince was not my choice, and the king just became my father. This gave me a high starting point, but I cannot deny one thing, the king was not a good father. If I were an ordinary person, I might happily accept everything, but I'm not. Some believe that parents managing children like possessions, with children completely obeying parents, is perfectly natural. However, I don't see it that way. I have my independent views and understanding, so if the original family leans towards the good, I try to integrate, if it leans towards the bad, I choose to break free. In other words, if a baby without cognitive ability encounters so-called parents, good or bad, due to its limited capacity, it can only be controlled by parents. But if an adult with a complete worldview suddenly meets his parents and finds them to be villains, fanatical and arrogant, often unreasonable, this person can choose to escape. Now, do you understand? William didn't quite understand Richard's words, but it didn't stop his face from turning unsightly. He looked up at Richard with a gaze that became incredibly serious. My brother, Richard, you are really smart, so smart it's a little frightening. To be honest, I initially felt some reluctance to kill you. But what you said today has firmed my resolve. I don't care why you're so clever or how you know so much, but you must die. Because if you don't, I'll never sleep soundly. William closed his eyes and took a deep breath, then opened them, saying, people like you shouldn't exist in this world. Your presence is a disaster for everyone around you. Since childhood, everyone who comes into contact with you, whether me, father, maids, or soldiers, feels a kind of fear as if you could see through what everyone is thinking. I know you've always been studying these things related to wizards, but even before you master them, I feel like the legendary wizard might just be like you. I've changed my mind. I won't say you poisoned father, I'll say you turned into an evil wizard. And being an evil wizard, you must die. Whoosh, William raised his hand high and shouted at the archers, kill him. The archers' bodies shuddered, they glanced at each other, but no one moved. After all, he was the kingdom's second prince, the future duke, and they were just soldiers. And, having heard those words just now. But William's authority still held. Seeing the archers remain motionless, he directly drew his sword with a clang and said coldly, I said kill him. Or you'll die. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. Under William's command, rows of longbows were raised, arrows knocked. Fire. Swish 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 swish. In William's roar, arrows shot like locusts, aiming directly at Richard from dozens of meters away. At that distance, not to mention Richard wearing a robe, even wearing plate armor wouldn't stop them. Yet Richard, as he watched the rain of arrows flying toward him, remained utterly composed. His lips moved slightly, and the next moment, a large whirlwind of air surged and solidified in front of him. Whish, the feathers on the arrows quivered rhythmically, drawing nearer and nearer to Richard, then, suddenly, as if hitting an obstacle, entering an invisible force field, their speed drastically reduced, then slowed even more. Moments later, when all their momentum was spent, the arrows were suspended in midair. 1, 2, 3. Finally, nearly 100 arrows hovered half a meter in front of Richard, completely unharmed. Spell, extreme wind shield. This. The archers widened their eyes, and William's mouth slowly fell open. This. Didn't you say I'm an evil wizard, so I must be killed? In a sense, you're right. Indeed, I am a wizard, though more accurately, a wizard apprentice. Kill him. Fire at an angle. Shoot. William's voice rang from deep in his throat, filled with indescribable terror. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. The archers, arms trembling, raised their longbows even higher, arrows knocked with great difficulty, fired at high angles upwards. Swish swish swish. Then each arrow traced an arc overhead, falling from the sky, some directly deflected, others burrowing into the invisible barrier before again halting. Above Richard's head, a mass of arrows floated. Silence, a death-like silence. Autumn rain fell, the droplets hitting the skin cold and bone-chillingly cold, a cold that made the spirit shiver. Richard waved a hand, and the surrounding air returned to normal, the arrows suspended in the air clattering to the ground, breaking the silence, disturbing the autumn rain. The soldiers grew slightly restless. A cluster of green flames flickered into being in Richard's hand, burning quietly in the rain. The next moment, Richard raised his hand, and the green flames suddenly soared skyward, rising higher and higher, finally swelling into a massive fireball a meter in diameter before bursting with a puff, as if signaling something. Richard waved his hand again, sending a crimson flame flying straight towards William. Before anyone could react, it struck William's face, then spread to his hair, eyebrows, luxurious robes. Flames surged up, and William let out a terrified shriek, tumbling to the ground, rolling to extinguish the fire. The soldiers, anxious and uneasy, looked at Richard, already feeling the urge to lay down their weapons. Although Richard hadn't killed a single person or displayed overpowering combat ability, who knew how many more terrifying spells were hidden within this prince's body? The unknown was the truly terrifying thing. Richard took a step forward, and immediately all the soldiers recoiled in terror, like a retreating tide. Richard smiled, William rolled on the ground, almost screaming, as from afar. Outside the palace, a black four-wheeled carriage swiftly approached. The wheels rumbled over the flagstone surface, producing a sound like thunderclaps. Boom boom boom.